Augustus Rohr didn't knock. He never knocked. The door to the Bellamy farmhouse in Caldwell, Missouri swung open so hard it cracked against the interior wall, and the two men who walked in behind him didn't bother closing it. Lenora's mother was standing at the kitchen table, folding linens when they entered, and she dropped everything in her hands. Augustus walked past her like she was furniture. He moved through the small house with the particular confidence of a man who believed that everything his eyes landed on already belonged to him, or would soon enough. He stopped at the table where Lenora's father had left his deed paperwork. He picked it up. He read it slowly, not because he needed to understand it, but because he wanted the Bellamy family to watch him read it. He wanted them to feel the weight of how little their names on that paper actually meant. Then he set it down, smiled a smile with no warmth anywhere in it, and said, "You've got until Friday." That was 4 years ago. And that moment the door swinging open, her mother's hands going still, that smile was the last thing Lenora Bellamy thought about before she stepped off the stagecoach at Black Pine Crossing and looked up at a mountain she had never seen before in her life. If this story moves you, if you've ever watched someone powerful walk into a room and take what wasn't theirs, please subscribe to this channel and follow Lenora's story all the way through. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next. The stagecoach from Ridgemont had taken 11 days. Lenora had not complained once, which was not a virtue so much as a habit. Complaining required energy she had learned to spend on other things. She spent it on watching the terrain shifting from flat Missouri bottomland into higher, rougher country, the pines thickening on the slopes, the air turning drier and sharper as the elevation climbed. She spent it on thinking, planning, running through contingencies the way another woman might run through a rosary. By the time the driver called out Black Pine Crossing and the coach lurched to a stop, Lenora had already decided 3 things about the arrangement she was walking into. First, she would not lie about who she was, not directly. She would withhold. She would manage what she revealed, and when, but she would not construct a false identity, because false identities had seams, and seams got found. Second, she would work harder than anyone expected, because the quickest way to make a man comfortable with your presence was to make yourself useful before he had time to form a real opinion of you. Third, if Rhett Callaway turned out to be a cruel man, or a greedy one, or the kind of man who hit she would leave. She had already run once. She could run again. She climbed down from the coach without waiting for the driver to offer a hand. Her trunk was heavy. She dragged it herself. The town of Black Pine Crossing was smaller than she'd expected. One main street, a general store, a livery, a land office, a saloon that doubled as a meeting hall by the look of the chairs stacked outside it, a hotel that needed painting. Maybe 400 people in the whole valley, if you counted the ranching families spread across the surrounding acreage. She stood on the boardwalk and looked around. A man was leaning against the post office wall with his arms crossed, watching her the way a person watches something they haven't decided about yet. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than most men she'd seen, with dark hair gone a little gray at the temples and a face that had taken its share of weather. He wore work clothes, not dress clothes, which she noted. Could have dressed up for this. He hadn't. He pushed off the wall and walked toward her. "Lenora Bellamy," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Mr. Callaway," she said. He looked at her trunk, then at her, then at the trunk again. "You dragged that yourself. It's not that heavy." It was heavy. They both knew it. He reached down and picked it up with one hand like it was a feed sack, and she felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not attraction, not yet, just a kind of recalibration. He was stronger than he looked, and he looked plenty strong already. "My wagon's over here," he said. She followed him. He didn't make small talk on the way to the wagon, and she didn't try to fill the silence. Later, she would understand that this was one of the few things about her that actually impressed him in those first minutes, that she didn't feel compelled to fill silence. Most people did. Rhett Callaway had spent 3 years being talked at by people who wanted something from him, and he had developed a particular exhaustion for words that didn't carry any weight. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, not gallant, just practical, and they started up the mountain road. The road was steep in places, and the horses knew it. Rhett handled them the way a man handles animals he's worked with, long enough to know their habits. Not gentle, exactly. "Sure, the arrangement," he said, about a mile up the road. "Yes. I want to be clear about it before we get there." "All right. This is a 30-day trial. You stay near the main house, help manage the household accounts, and some of the ranch operations if you're willing. At the end of 30 days, we decide if we continue. And if we don't continue, I'll pay your way back to wherever you want to go." She looked at him sideways. "That's a fair offer." "It's a practical one," he said. "I'm not a romantic man, Miss Bellamy. I had a wife. She died. I have a ranch that takes 18 hours a day to run properly, and I've been trying to run it alone for 3 years. That's what this is." She nodded. "I understand what it is." He glanced at her, just briefly, and something in her tone seemed to make him adjust something small inside himself. She hadn't said it to wound him. She'd said it because it was true, and she recognized true things when she heard them. "All right then," he said. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The ranch appeared as they crested a long ridge, and even Lenora, who had trained herself not to react visibly to things, went still for a moment. It was vast. Not just in acreage, though the acreage was staggering. It was the organization of the place that struck her. The main house was large and solid, built with the kind of permanence that said the man who built it wasn't planning to leave. Beyond it, the barns and outbuildings were laid out in a deliberate arrangement, not scattered the way smaller working ranches often were, but placed with thought, close enough for efficiency, far enough for safety. Corrals, a smithy, bunkhouse, a root cellar built into the hillside. At the far edge of the property, she could see cattle moving in the lower pasture, at least 100 head from this distance. A man was waiting in the yard when the wagon pulled in. He was lean and sun-darkened, maybe 50, with the kind of posture that suggested he'd been standing in yards waiting for things for most of his adult life. "That's Wade Holloway," Rhett said. "My ranch manager. He's worked this land longer than I have." Wade nodded at her when they climbed down. "Miss Bellamy." He didn't smile, but his eyes weren't unfriendly. He was reading her the same way she was reading him, quick and quiet, filing information. "Mr. Holloway," she said. "I'll show you to your room," Rhett said. "I'd rather see the accounts first," she said. Both men looked at her. "The accounts," Rhett repeated. "You mentioned the ranch management. I'd rather start there than spend the day settling in. The settling in can happen after dark." She met his look steadily. "Unless you'd prefer I wait." A long pause. "Wade," Rhett said. "Show her to the office." Wade almost smiled. Almost. The accounts were a mess. Not catastrophically, the ranch was too well run for catastrophe, but there were errors that had been accumulating quietly for at least 2 years. Small discrepancies in the feed purchasing records. A supply contract with a Ridgemont merchant that was priced 30% above what the same supplies cost from a competing merchant 2 towns over. 3 ranch hands listed on the payroll who Lenora could not find any corresponding work records for. She sat at the desk in Rhett's office for 4 hours, while the afternoon light shifted across the floor. She asked Wade for clarifications twice. He gave them without argument, though she could tell he wasn't certain whether to be impressed or irritated. Rhett came in around 6 o'clock. She had filled 4 pages of her own paper with notes. He looked at the pages. Well, she told him what she'd found. He was quiet for a while after she finished. The kind of quiet that wasn't comfortable. "Those 3 hands," he said finally. "I let them go last winter. I meant to clear them from the books. You forgot. I had other things happening." "Everyone does," she said. Not unkindly. "The supply contract is the more immediate issue. You're losing roughly $200 a year on that one arrangement alone." He stared at the pages. "How long did it take you to find all this?" 4 hours. Another silence. "Supper's ready," he said. "Mrs. Dupree, the cook, she leaves a plate if I'm not in by 6. "All right." She gathered her notes and followed him to the kitchen. It was the first meal she ate at Blackpine, and neither of them said much during it. But when it was done and she pushed back from the table to carry her plate to the basin, he said, without looking up from his coffee, "You're good at that." "At accounts?" "At seeing things." She didn't answer. She washed her plate, dried it, and put it back where she found it. She was very, very good at not answering certain kinds of questions. The second week was harder than the first, in ways she hadn't anticipated. The first week she'd spent establishing competence, reorganizing the supply records, renegotiating the feed contract through a written inquiry to the Ridgemont merchant, correcting the payroll, repairing the household inventory system that had been run on guesswork since the previous housekeeper had left 18 months ago. The work was concrete and she was good at it, and it kept her mind pointed in directions that felt safe. The second week the work was still there, but she'd cleared enough of the backlog that there were hours in the day when she had nothing specific to do. Those were the dangerous hours. In those hours she walked the fence lines by herself, ostensibly checking for damage. In those hours, she noticed that the mountain was very quiet in the way that open country is quiet, not peacefully, but absolutely, in a way that left no place for noise to hide. In those hours, she thought about Missouri, about the Bellamy farmhouse with its door swinging open, about her father's face, which had gone gray in the months after Rohr's men started closing in gray, in the way a man's face goes gray when the thing he built and the thing he owes both live in the same building, and there's no way to separate them. Her father had made mistakes. She had never pretended otherwise, not even to herself. He'd borrowed money he couldn't repay from people who had every reason to expect repayment. And when the repayment didn't come, those people had gone looking for leverage. Augustus Rohr had been the leverage. He'd bought up her father's debts and used them as a crowbar, and by the time Lenora understood the full shape of what was happening, the farmhouse was already in Rohr's name on a document that didn't look quite right to her, but that she couldn't prove, not then, not immediately. Spent 4 years proving it. The document box was in her trunk, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked under everything else she owned. It contained 247 pages of evidence, deeds that didn't match the originals in the county records, ledger entries from 2 different sets of books, the ones Rohr showed his business partners, and the ones she'd found by accident in a file cabinet in his Caldwell office on the night she'd stayed late to finish a clerical job he'd hired her to do. Affidavits from 3 families who'd lost property the same way her family had, signed and witnessed. A letter, in Rohr's own handwriting, that contained language which in the context of the other documents amounted to a written confession of at least 1 count of fraud. She had those 247 pages because she had spent 4 years working in offices adjacent to Rohr's operation, making herself useful, making herself invisible, copying and documenting with a patience that had consumed the better part of her 20s and left her with very few friends and no permanent address. She had run when Rohr's man Gareth Sully had found the duplicate key she'd made for the file room. She had run fast, and she had run far, and she had run in the direction of the one arrangement that would give her a legitimate reason to be somewhere completely off Rohr's map. Rhett Callaway's advertisement in the correspondence agency newsletter had been the most practical exit she could find. She thought about all of this during her 2nd week at Black Pine, walking fence lines she didn't need to walk, and she told herself, as she had told herself before, that the arrangement was fair to everyone. Rhett got a competent partner. She got distance and time. No one was being deceived about anything that actually mattered. She almost believed it. The thing that complicated the almost belief was Rhett himself. She had expected a certain kind of wealthy man. She had met several of them in Missouri, men who had money and knew they had it, men whose generosity was really just a different kind of control. She had expected someone who treated his employees as extensions of his property, who issued orders without explaining them, who measured people by their usefulness and discarded them when the usefulness ended. Rhett Callaway was not that. He was difficult, yes. He had a particular stubbornness about the way he did certain things, a resistance to change that was bone deep in places, and she recognized it as the stubbornness of a man who had survived by trusting his own judgment and had learned, in the years since his wife died, to trust almost nothing else. He could be abrupt. He forgot to say thank you sometimes, not out of arrogance, but out of the same inward turning focus that made him good at running the ranch. He was not a man who naturally shared what was going on inside him, and on the occasions when something showed on his face, something that looked like loneliness, or like the sudden absence of whatever was keeping the loneliness in check, he would turn away from her quickly, as if she'd caught him doing something he hadn't meant to do. But he was fair, consistently, unglamorously fair, in the way that actually cost something. He paid his ranch hands what they were worth and told them why when he adjusted their wages up or down. He didn't take shortcuts on the livestock care, even in the bad weeks when the workload was crushing and a shortcut would have been invisible. When a section of the south fence failed and 2 of the cattle got into a neighboring family's grain store and damaged a portion of the harvest, he rode to that family's farm himself the next morning and paid for the damage without being asked and without complaining about it. She watched these things without commenting on them. She was very aware that she was watching. On the 17th day, she found the problem with the water rights. She hadn't been looking for it. She was cross-referencing the ranch's land survey against the county records she'd requested from the Black Pine Crossing Land Office routine due diligence, kind of check she performed automatically on any property she was managing when she found the discrepancy. A tributary that ran along the eastern edge of Rhett's property, feeding 3 of his stock ponds, was listed in the county records as shared-use water, meaning 2 other ranches had legal access to it. But in the records Rhett had shown her, the tributary appeared as fully private. The documentation Rhett held was older and less official than the county record. In a legal dispute, the county record would likely prevail. This mattered because the 2 ranches with the shared-use claim had both been recently acquired by a Ridgemont land development company called the Cascadia Territorial Group. She wrote that name down and stared at it for a long time. Then she went to find Rhett. He was in the North Corral, working a young horse that clearly had opinions about the whole situation. She waited by the fence and watched him work. He had a particular way of moving around a difficult animal, not aggressive, not backing down, but patient in a way that seemed almost physical. Like patience was something he was putting into the space between himself and the horse, rather than just deciding to feel. When he finally brought the horse down to a walk and came to the fence, his shirt was damp and there was a long smear of dust across one forearm. "What is it?" he said. He could tell by now the difference between her coming to him with a question and coming to him with a problem. Told him about the water rights. He listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was not automatic for him. He had to choose to listen the way some men had to choose to stay calm, consciously, as an act of will. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she counted it. "Cascadia Territorial Group," he said. "You've heard of them. They've been buying land in the Eastern Valley for about 8 months. He looked at the fence post between his hands. "I didn't think they were this close. They may not be doing anything improper with the water rights," she said carefully. "The shared use designation may simply be a matter of historical record, or it's a pressure point." She said nothing. "If they claim water access and I dispute it," he said, thinking out loud, "that's a legal process that could take years and cost money, even if I win." He looked up, "And if I'm tied up in a legal fight, I'm not expanding. I'm not taking on new cattle. I'm not doing anything except paying lawyers." "Yes," she said, "which makes me vulnerable." "Yes." He looked at her directly then, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not anger at her. Anger at something he was beginning to recognize. "This has happened before," he said, "to other ranches in the territory. I don't know the specific histories here," she said, which was true as far as it went. "I do," he said, "the Farlow place 2 years ago. The Hennessy Ranch last spring. Both of them got caught up in legal disputes over boundaries or water, and both of them sold it out at below value inside 18 months. He set his jaw. Cascadia Territorial Group bought both of those properties. The silence between them had a particular weight now. "I want to know everything you can find about that company," he said. "Who owns it? Who funds it? Who's doing the legal work?" She nodded. She was already afraid of what she would find. She found it in 3 days. She didn't have access to the kind of records she'd have needed for certainty. Those were in Ridgemont or in a territorial capital filing office she couldn't reach from Black Pine. But she had her instincts, and she had the pattern recognition she'd developed over 4 years of looking at the edges of how Roar operated, and what she found in the publicly accessible records was enough. The Cascadia Territorial Group was incorporated in Missouri. Its legal representative in territorial matters was a Ridgemont attorney named Clement Foss, who had also represented a land operator named Harlan Bray, who had been investigated unsuccessfully for a property fraud scheme in eastern Kansas 3 years prior. Harlan Bray had been a business associate of Augustus Roar. She sat with this information for 2 hours before she told Rhett. During those 2 hours, she went through every possible way of managing what came next. Every way of giving Rhett what he needed, while keeping her own position contained. She was good at this kind of triage. She had done it before. But when she sat with it long enough, she kept coming back to the same place. She couldn't give him a useful warning without explaining how she knew what she knew. And she couldn't explain that without telling him the truth. She found him after supper on the porch. He was sitting with his coffee going cold in his hand, looking out at the mountain in the last of the evening light. He heard her step and turned. She sat down across from him. She said, "There's something I need to tell you." He didn't say anything for a long time after she finished. She had told him the whole of it. The farmhouse door, her father's debt, the 4 years of careful, frightened documentation, the 247 pages in the trunk, the way she'd found out about the marriage arrangement through the correspondence agency newsletter and had made the decision to use it as a way out, not randomly, not desperately, but with intention. 'Cause a remote mountain ranch in a territory where Roar had no established presence had seemed, to her exhausted and careful mind, like the one place where she might buy herself enough time to figure out what to do next. She told him that the Cascadia connection was not confirmed, but that the patterns aligned with how Roar expanded, and that she believed Rhett's ranch was inside a radius that Roar or his associates were already mapping. She told him that she was sorry for the deception, that she had told herself it was fair, that she was giving him real value in exchange for the arrangement, that she still believed she had given real value, but that she understood it was a deception regardless. She sat very still through all of it and watched him. Rhett set his coffee cup down on the porch railing. He stood up and walked to the far end of the porch and stood there with his back to her for a while. Then he said, "You've been doing this alone for 4 years." "Yes." "Running, collecting evidence, with no one to help you." "I had a few people who were willing to sign affidavits, but yes, mostly alone." He turned around. His face was not what she expected. She had expected anger. She had braced for it, the way you brace when you know the blow is coming, calculating where it will land and how to recover. What she saw instead was something more complicated, something that looked, in the unsteady evening light, a little like recognition. "He took your family's land," Rhett said, "and you spent 4 years getting the proof to take it back. To hold him accountable," she said carefully. "The land may not be recoverable." "No," he said, "but you went after it anyway." A long pause. "What's in the document box?" he said. "The 247 pages. Is it enough?" She looked at him steadily. "If I can get it to the right authorities, yes. I believe so." Rhett picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. "All right," he said. She waited. In the morning, he said, "I'm going to ride to town and talk to Marshal Shaw. He's federal. He has jurisdiction that goes beyond the territory." He looked at her directly. "I'm going to need you to tell me which documents to start with. What will make him take this seriously before he's seen everything?" Lenora blinked. "Just once." "You're not angry," she said. "I didn't say that." His voice had a particular flatness to it that she recognized as the sound of a man controlling something carefully. "I'm angry. You came here under false pretenses and you let me trust you, or start to, before I understood what I was actually dealing with." "Yes," she said, "that's accurate." "But you also," he said, and stopped. She waited. "You also found problems with my ranch that my own people had been walking past for 2 years," he said. "And you told me the truth when you didn't have to. You could have just kept managing it, kept the information to yourself. I wouldn't have known. I thought about that. I know you did." He looked at her with the same steadiness she'd been directing at him for 3 weeks. "That's why I'm talking to you, instead of telling you to get your trunk." Lenora felt something move through her that she didn't have an easy name for. Relief was too small a word and gratitude was too soft. It was something closer to the feeling of putting down a weight you'd been carrying long enough that you'd forgotten. The weight was separate from you. She didn't let it show on her face. "The first document he needs to see," she said, "is the letter. The one in Roar's handwriting. It references the Meridian property by name and contains language about 'I'll show you which section in the morning.' The most immediate evidence of intent." "Good," Rhett said. Picked up the cold coffee, drank it anyway, and went inside. Lenora sat on the porch for a while longer. The mountain was very dark now and very quiet, and somewhere below in the valley a coyote called out, and nothing answered it. She thought, "I have made a miscalculation. I thought I came here to hide. I think I may have come here to stop hiding." She didn't know yet if that was a good thing. She was almost afraid to find out. Rhett rode to town before sunrise. Lenora heard his horse leave the particular sound of hooves on the packed dirt of the yard, moving at a pace that wasn't hurried but wasn't casual either. The pace of a man who had made a decision in the night and was acting on it before the thinking part of his brain had a chance to complicate things. She lay in her bed in the small room off the main hall and stared at the ceiling and listened until the sound disappeared into the mountain quiet. Then she got up, dressed, and went to work. She had the document box open on the desk by the time the cook, Mrs. Dupree, came in to start the kitchen fire. Mrs. Dupree was a stout woman of about 60 who had worked at the ranch for 7 years and had seen enough changes in that time to develop a deep personal policy of not being surprised by anything. She looked at Lenora sitting at the desk in the gray pre-dawn light with papers spread across every available surface and said, "Coffee," as if it were a prescription, and went to put the pot on. Lenora worked through the documents one more time. Not because she didn't know them, She knew them the way you know things you've handled so often in the dark that you can identify them by texture alone, but because she needed to organize them into something Marshal Shaw could follow. A federal marshal was not a person who had 4 years to spend building context. He would need the shape of the thing in the first 20 minutes, or he would start looking for reasons to put it down. She identified 7 key documents. She arranged them in order of immediate impact, the handwritten letter first, then the dual ledger pages, then the 3 forged deeds, then the affidavits, and wrote a brief summary page that connected each document to the next without the kind of legal language that made a person's eyes slide off the page. She was on her 3rd cup of coffee and had just finished the summary when Wade Holloway appeared in the office doorway. He looked at the papers. He looked at her. He came in and sat down in the chair across the desk without being invited, which told her something about how long he'd been working at this ranch and how he understood his own position within it. He told you, she said. Not a question. Before he left, Wade said. Some of it she waited. He told me about the Cascadia connection, Wade said, and about where you came from. He had his hat in his hands and was turning it slowly, the brim moving through his fingers with the automatic patience of a man who'd developed a lot of physical habits to occupy himself while his mind worked. He didn't tell me about the document box. No, she said. He wouldn't. Wade looked at the papers on the desk. Those are the evidence, part of it. He was quiet for a moment. How bad is it? What this man Rohr has done. She had answered this question before in various forms to various people. She always tried to answer it accurately, without inflation, because inflation was one of the things that got a case dismissed. Before it started, you told someone it was worse than it was, and when the evidence didn't quite match the telling, the whole thing got fragile. Bad enough, she said. 11 families in Missouri that I can document directly. Probably more that I couldn't reach. Property fraud mostly, but fraud that took everything, not just land but the businesses attached to the land, the credit lines that depended on the land as collateral, the livelihoods that ran on all of it. She paused. 2 of those families had elderly members who died within a year of losing the property. Can't prove a direct connection, but I know what I saw. Wade had gone stills in the way men go still when they're absorbing something that hits a nerve they didn't expect. My mother's family lost property, he said, not elaborating, just placing it. Where, Texas? Different situation, different men. He turned his hat again, but the shape of it's the same. They sat with that for a moment. Rhett trusts you, she said. Not testing, just acknowledging a fact. He didn't used to, Wade said. Took about 2 years. He's not a fast truster. He looked at her directly. Had trusted you faster than most. She didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't do anything with it. Stacked the 7 key documents into a clean pile and squared the edges. Is there anything on the ranch that needs doing today that can't wait? She asked. Nothing that can't wait, Wade said. I'll manage it. Thank you. He stood, put his hat back on, and moved to the door. Then he stopped. Miss Bellamy. Yes. Whatever Rhett decides to do about this, about Rohr and the Cascadia people, he's going to need someone who understands the full picture. Not just the legal picture, the personal one. He looked at her with the measured directness of a man who chose his words carefully and spent them carefully too. I hope you'll stay available for that. She looked back at him. I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Holloway. He nodded once and left. She sat in the quiet of the office and thought about what she'd just said and understood that she'd meant it more than she expected to. Rhett came back late afternoon. She heard the horse in the yard and watched from the office window as he dismounted and handed the reins to one of the younger hands without saying anything. He stood in the yard for a moment with his back to the house, and she could read something in the set of his shoulders, not defeat, but the particular kind of tired that comes from having a hard conversation that didn't go the way you expected, and now you have to figure out what to do with that. She met him in the hallway. Shaw listened, he said. He moved toward the kitchen, and she followed. He poured water from the pitcher on the side table and drank it before he said anything else. He was careful about it. He didn't dismiss it, but he said he'd need more than I could describe to him verbally. He needs to see the documents himself. That's expected, she said. He also said Rhett set the cup down. He said he'd been hearing things about Cascadia for a few months. Nothing that had moved to a formal complaint yet, but he'd been hearing it from more than one direction. He looked at her. Which means we're probably not the first ranch they've moved against. No, she said. Probably not. He wants to meet with you. In person. He wants to go through the documents with you directly. He paused. I told him I'd need to discuss it with you first. She appreciated that more than she showed. When? He suggested 2 days from now. He'd come here to the ranch. Fewer people watching. She thought about this. A federal marshal coming to the ranch was not nothing. It would be noticed by anyone in the valley who tracked that kind of movement, and in a small territory, people tracked it. But the alternative was her riding into town with the document box, which was worse. All right, she said. Here's better. Rhett nodded. He moved to the kitchen doorway and stopped with one hand on the frame, looking at the floor. He asked me one question I didn't know how to answer. She waited. He asked how you came to be here. At this ranch. At this particular time. He looked up. I told him you came through the correspondence agency, which is true. But he's a careful man and he's going to ask you more than that. Tell him the truth, she said. The same truth you told me? Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. She had the impression he was making a decision that had nothing to do with the marshal and everything to do with something more internal, something he was working through in the part of himself he didn't put on display. Okay, he said, and went to find Mrs. Dupree about supper. 2 days before Marshal Shaw's visit were not quiet days. On the first morning after Rhett's trip to town, a man appeared at the ranch gate. He was unfamiliar, not one of the regular hands, not anyone from the Valley family she'd met through Rhett's accounts. He said he was from a surveying company in Ridgemont and asked to speak to the ranch owner about verifying the eastern property boundary. Rhett was in the north pasture. Wade was the one who talked to the man. Lenora watched the conversation from the porch. Couldn't hear it, but she watched Wade's body language change. About halfway through a slight squaring of the shoulders, a shift in weight, and when the man left without coming any further than the gate, she went to find Wade. What did he actually want? She asked. Wade looked back toward the gate. He wanted to know if we'd had any contact with the county land office about the eastern tributary. She felt a cold, familiar tightening in her chest. He asked specifically about the tributary? Specific enough. Wade's jaw was set. Said it in a roundabout way, framed it as routine survey work. Asked if there had been any recent inquiries about the water access on that section. He looked at her. Nobody from a legitimate surveying company leads with that question. No, she said. They don't. She told him about Gareth Sully, then Roar's man, the one who'd found her duplicate key, the one who had been Roar's primary instrument for managing situations that required a combination of observation and intimidation. She described him, medium height, deliberate in his movements, a way of asking questions that sounded administrative and wasn't. Wade listened. The man at the gate wasn't him, but he had the same manner you're describing. Roar uses a network, she said. He doesn't send Sully for everything. Sully is for the situations that have already escalated. She paused. The fact that he sent someone at all means he knows I'm here. This landed between them with the weight of something that had been suspected and was now confirmed. How, Wade said. The correspondence agency, she said. I used my real name. I thought the distance seemed like enough. Missouri to a mountain territory. Through an agency with dozens of files, I thought it would be too much work to track. She shook her head. I underestimated how much work he was willing to do, or how much he feared what was in that document box. I need to tell Rhett, she said. He's going to want to increase the hands on the perimeter, Wade said. He should. Wade was already moving. Rhett's reaction to the news about the surveyor was controlled and precise in the way that told her the anger was real and was being managed carefully. He asked 3 questions: how long the man had stayed at the gate, whether he'd had any visible companions at a distance, whether Wade had gotten a full description. Then he gave instructions to 2 of the senior ranch hands about the perimeter schedule and told Mrs. Dupree that until further notice the front gate was not to be opened for strangers without one of the senior staff present. After that he came to find Lenora. She was in the office, where she'd returned to go through the documents one more time, not out of compulsion, but because the surveyor's appearance had changed the timeline in her mind, and she wanted to confirm she hadn't missed anything. He knows you're here, Rhett said. Yes, and the documents are here. Yes. He sat down across from her. It was late in the afternoon, and the light in the office was amber and low. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor between his boots, and she had the impression he was conducting a private internal accounting of what he'd known when he'd agreed to this arrangement, what he knew now, and what that gap meant for how he proceeded. I need you to understand something, he said finally. She watched him. I've been running this ranch for 12 years. 8 of those years with Eleanor, my wife, and the last 3 alone. And in 12 years, I've never had to think about whether the people on this property were safe. He looked up, thought about weather, prices, drought, disease in the herd, a dozen other things. Not this. I understand, she said. I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty.
I know.
I'm saying it because I want you to know that
He stopped.
tried again. I'm not angry at you for bringing this here. I'm angry at the situation, which is different. He said it carefully, as if he was checking the words against something internal as he produced them, making sure they were accurate. You didn't create this problem. You've been carrying it for 4 years by yourself, and now it's followed you here, and I'd rather deal with it together than... He stopped again. Then send me away, she said quietly. Yes. She looked at the document spread across the desk. 247 pages that had cost her 4 years and her father's health, and most of what she'd thought her life was going to look like. She looked at them, and she thought about the particular loneliness of carrying something like that alone, the way it's changed how you moved through rooms, how you sat with your back to walls, how you listened to every footstep in a hallway and categorized it before it reached your door. I didn't know how to let anyone else into it, she said. Not an excuse. Just I know, he said. He stood up. He stood there for a moment in the amber light with his hands at his sides, and he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has something more to say and isn't going to say it. Not yet. Get some sleep tonight, he said. Shaw comes day after tomorrow. You'll need to be sharp. I'm always sharp, she said. I know that too, he said, and left. She sat alone in the office for a long time after, with the mountain dark outside the window and the document spread before her, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years. It was uncomfortable and unfamiliar, and she didn't trust it fully. Felt like not being alone. Marshall Everett Shaw was not what she'd pictured from Rhett's description. She had imagined a certain type, the frontier lawman variety, weathered and formal, kind of official, who had learned to hide his intelligence behind procedural language, because intelligence made people nervous, and nervous people lied more than calm people. She'd dealt with several of that type in her 4 years of evidence gathering, and she knew how to talk to them. Shaw was different. He was maybe 45, with reading glasses he wore pushed up onto his forehead and brought down only when he was looking at a document. He had the kind of face that had been pleasant once and was still pleasant. In the way old wood is pleasant, there was history in it. And the history had been more complicated than easy. He arrived alone, which told her something. He sat across from her at the desk, without doing the usual territorial things men in positions of authority did, without moving things to establish space, without picking up her documents without asking, without directing the first questions at Rhett instead of her. He looked at her and said, "Tell me in your own words. Start where it started." She started where it started. She talked for a long time. Shaw listened with his glasses down, looking at the documents as she referenced them, occasionally asking a question that was precise and well-placed, the kind of question that tells you. The listener is not just receiving information, but building a structure with it, checking the load-bearing points. Rhett sat in the corner of the room and didn't say much. He asked one question himself, about the Cascadia Group's connection to the Missouri operation, and Shaw looked at him with the particular attention of a man recalibrating something. "You've been connecting those dots yourself," Shaw said to Rhett. "It wasn't hard," Rhett said. "Once you know what you're looking at." Shaw looked back at Lenora, the letter, the one in Roar's handwriting. She found it and handed it across the desk. He read it twice. The second time slowly. He set it down and took his glasses off entirely and held them in one hand. "This is enough to open a formal investigation," he said. Lenora felt something move through her that she didn't let reach her face. "Enough to open it," she said carefully. "Not necessarily to conclude it." "No," he agreed. "But it gets us in the door." He looked at the full stack of documents. "I need copies of everything. I can have a court clerk." "I'll make the copies myself," she said. "I'd prefer the originals not to leave this room until we're further along." Shaw looked at her. "You don't trust the process." "Trust you," she said. "I don't trust every step between you and a courtroom." He accepted this without argument, which confirmed what she'd started to think about him. "How long to make copies?" 3 days. 4 if the paper supply here is limited." "It won't be," Rhett said from the corner. Shaw nodded. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, the gesture of a man gathering his next thought from somewhere overhead. "You said a man came to the gate 2 days ago," he said. "Yes," Rhett said. "Asking about the tributary. Asking in a way that was really about whether we'd had contact with the land office," Lenora said. Shaw brought his gaze back to her. "Roar knows you're here." Almost certainly. Then we don't have as much time as I'd like. He put his glasses back on. Once the investigation opens formally, he'll have resources on this within days. Good attorneys? People in the territorial administration who owe him consideration. He's been building those relationships for a long time. He looked at Rhett. Your ranch will be looked at. His people will go over every public record you have, looking for something they can use as a counter-narrative. Let them look, Rhett said. They may find things. Not wrongdoing, I'm not suggesting that. But complexity. Kind of complexity that muddies water in front of a jury. Then we make the water clear before they get to it, Rhett said. He said it simply, without performance, and Shaw looked at him with a kind of respect that was also a form of assessment. You understand, Shaw said, that being visibly connected to this case will affect your standing in the territory. People associate themselves with ongoing investigations in people's minds whether they mean to or not. My standing in the territory, Rhett said, is not the most important thing in this room. The silence that followed was short and deliberate. Shaw closed his folder. I'll start the formal process from Ridgemont. I'll need a week to get the paperwork to the right office, without it going through a channel that Rohr might have access to. In the meantime, be careful who you talk to about this. Not everyone in Black Pine Crossing is going to be neutral. Is anyone? Lenora asked. Some, Shaw said. Fewer than you'd hope. More than you'd fear. He stood and picked up his hat. I'll be in contact. Through Callaway, directly, not through any third party. He shook Rhett's hand, nodded to Lenora, and left. They listened to his horse leave the yard. The copying took 4 days. Lenora worked at the desk each morning from before sunrise until mid-afternoon, reproducing each document in a clear hand that was not quite a duplicate of her own normal writing. She'd learned long ago that if she was copying something sensitive, it was better to write in a way that looked like someone else's hand, so that if a copy ever surfaced in the wrong place, there would be a layer of ambiguity about its origin. It was a small habit and probably unnecessary here, but 4 years had made certain habits automatic. Rhett brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked to. He didn't linger when he did it. He set the cup on the corner of the desk that wasn't covered in paper and left without interrupting. This was not the same as the first week, when she'd had the impression that every interaction between them was a kind of interview, him watching her, categorizing her, adjusting his assessment of who she was and whether she belonged on his property. That quality had faded. What replaced it was something quieter and harder to name. A kind of habitual awareness. The specific attention of people who have been in a difficult situation together, long enough to stop having to explain things to each other. On the third evening of copying, she made an error on a ledger page and had to restart. She was tired and her hand cramped, and she set down the pen and pressed her palm flat on the desk and breathed. Rhett appeared in the doorway. He must have heard her. The house was quiet enough. All right, he said. Tired, she said. Which was true and also smaller than the truth, because tired was the surface of it, and underneath the surface was the weight of 4 years all concentrated into this week, into these papers, into the question of whether it would be enough, and whether it would hold, and whether Rohr had resources that could reach even this far. She didn't say any of that. Rhett came in and sat in the chair across the desk. He didn't say anything immediately, which she'd come to understand was not absence but presence. He was there, in a way that didn't require speech. Did you ever consider, he said eventually, giving the documents to someone else? Turning them over to an authority somewhere along the line and walking away from it? Yes, she said. Twice. What stopped you? She thought about it. The first time, I didn't trust the person I would have given them to. There were too many ways for them to disappear or get reinterpreted. She straightened the paper in front of her. The second time, the person I would have trusted was no longer in a position to act on it. They'd been removed from their office. I found out later that Rohr had been behind the removal. He was already watching more closely than I knew. So you kept going. I kept going. He was quiet for a moment. That's a kind of courage that most people don't recognize as courage, because it doesn't look like anything. It looks like stubbornness or obstinacy. He turned his coffee cup in his hand. I've been stubborn about things. Staying on this mountain after Eleanor died, when everyone expected me to move closer to town. Keeping the ranch the size it is, when every other large operation in the territory has been consolidating. He paused. My father called it stubbornness. Wade calls it something that's not quite the same as stubbornness, but he won't say exactly what. She almost smiled. What would you call it? Knowing what's worth holding on to, he said. Even when holding on costs something. She looked at him. In the lamplight, his face was tired but settled the face of a man who was uncomfortable with the situation and was not pretending otherwise, but who had decided what he was going to do about it and was past the point of second-guessing. "I don't know how to thank you for this," she said. She stopped. "For not throwing you out when I found out." "Yes. You found the supply contract problem," he said. "That alone will save this ranch $200 a year, for as long as I'm working with that merchant." He said it without particular expression. "We're probably even," she laughed. It was a short, surprised sound that she hadn't planned, and she felt it leave her before she could manage it, and she saw something flicker across his face, something quick and warm, there and gone. "Get some sleep," he said. "Finish it tomorrow." She finished it the next morning. Copies went to Shaw through a writer Rhett trusted a man named Cord Pickett, who had worked the mountain routes for 15 years, and who Shaw had used before for sensitive deliveries. The originals stayed in the document box in Lenora's room, now moved from the trunk to a location she'd discussed only with Rhett, and that she checked each morning and each night. The week after the copies left was a waiting week. Waiting weeks were the hardest. Lenora had learned this the first time she'd submitted evidence to an official authority and waited to see what happened to it. The active work had its own momentum, its own forward pressure that kept the fear compressed into a manageable shape. In the waiting, the fear expanded into the space the work had occupied and became more present, more textured, more willing to remind her of everything that could go wrong. She managed it by staying useful. She reorganized the livestock medication records, which had been kept in a system that made sense to whoever had originally created it and to no one else. She drafted a letter to the county assessor's office requesting clarification on the Eastern Tributary's official designation, framing it in language dry enough that it would read as routine. She began a survey of the ranch's structural needs, the outbuildings, the fencing, the conditions of the corrals, and produced a prioritized maintenance list that she gave to Wade without comment. Wade read it and said, "Did you sleep at all last night?" "Some," she said. He looked at her over the edge of the paper. "Rhett used to do this. After Eleanor. He'd work until he couldn't stand up because standing up and working was better than lying down and thinking." He handed the list back. "It helps, but it has a limit." She took the list. "I know." She was also, in those waiting days, becoming aware of something she'd been half aware of for a while, and had been filing in the category of things to examine later. The way Rhett moved differently when she was in the room. Not dramatically, he was not a demonstrative man, and she doubted he would become one. But she caught it in small things. The way he angled himself slightly toward her when they were in a conversation, even when the conversation was logistical and practical and entirely about supply contracts or water rights. The way he'd stopped masking his expressions quite as thoroughly as he had in the first 2 weeks, so that when something landed with him, something she said, something that amused or troubled him, she could see it briefly before he put it away. She didn't know what to do with this. She had not come here for this. She had come here with 247 pages, and a plan and a finite list of what she needed from the arrangement, and whatever was developing between her and Rhett Callaway was not on that list. She thought about it in the way she thought about problems she hadn't yet found the right framing for, held it lightly, examined it from different angles without yet pressing on it, waiting for the shape of it to become clear. She was still thinking about it on the Thursday of the waiting week, when 3 things happened in quick succession. The first, a writer arrived with a message from Shaw. The investigation was formally open. A federal complaint had been filed in Ridgemont. Shaw expected Rohr to know within 10 days. The second, Rhett found a section of the south fence that had been cut, cleanly, deliberately, with a tool not broken by cattle or weather. Cut section was on the western edge of the property, furthest from the main house. The third, Wade came in from the lower pasture at dusk and told them that a group of 4 men had been spotted at the tree line watching the house. They'd moved off before he could get close, but they'd been there. The 3 things arrived inside 2 hours. Rhett gathered the senior ranch hands in the main barn after supper. Lenora stood at the back of the group and listened as he laid out what he knew in the direct, unsentimental way. He did everything: the open investigation, the cut fence, the watchers at the tree line. He told them the truth about the situation, which she noted because many men in his position would have managed it, softened it, kept the danger at a distance from the people who worked for them. He didn't do that. "I'm not going to tell you this isn't a risk," he said. "It is. Anyone who's not comfortable with that can tell Wade, and I'll arrange pay through the end of the month and no hard feelings." He looked at the faces in front of him. Anyone who stays, I need you to be careful, and I need you to be honest with me about what you see and hear. That's all I'm asking. Nobody moved toward the door. She watched them, these men, most of whom had been working this ranch for years, some for the better part of a decade, and she thought about what she had set in motion by arriving here with her trunk and her document box and her plan. She had brought this danger with her. She had brought it to these men, to this ranch, to Rhett, and yet they were standing there, not moving toward the door. After the hands dispersed, she walked to where Rhett was standing by the barn door. He was watching the mountain in the dark, the way he sometimes watched it, not anxiously, but with the attention of a man who had learned to read it the way some people read faces. Roar is moving faster than I expected, she said. He's scared, Rhett said. Scared men move fast and make mistakes. Or they move fast and make sure they don't get a chance to make mistakes. He looked at her. Are you frightened? It was the first time he'd asked her directly. She thought about it, not performing the thinking, actually doing it, the way she did with questions she wanted to answer, honestly. Yes, she said. Not in the way I used to be frightened. When I was running, the fear was everywhere. Ambient. It lived in every room I walked into. She paused. This is different. This feels like something with edges. Something that has a specific shape and a specific timeline and specific things I can do about it. He nodded slowly. I'm still afraid, she said. I'm just not afraid the same way. Turned back to the mountain. That's probably the best you can do. They stood there together in the barn doorway for a while. The mountain was dark and the valley below was dark, and somewhere out on the western edge of the property was a section of fence that someone had cut with a tool, deliberately, as a message, or as a preparation, or as both. The investigation was open. The documents were copied and moving. Roar knew. Whatever was going to happen next was going to happen soon. Cut fence was repaired by morning. Rhett did it himself, before the hands were up, in the gray pre-dawn dark, with a lantern and a roll of wire, and the kind of focused silence that told Lenora, who had heard him leave and had gotten up to watch from the window, that he was doing it as much for himself as for the property. There was something in the act of fixing a thing with your hands that helped certain men think, and Rhett was one of those men. By the time the ranch was stirring and Mrs. Dupree had the kitchen fire going, he was back in the yard, and the fence was whole, and he hadn't said a word to anyone about it. Lenora had used the early hour to move the document box. She didn't tell Rhett she was doing it. She'd thought about it during the night, lying awake, in the particular way she'd lain awake for 4 years. The vigilant non-sleep that was her body's version of standing guard, and she'd decided that a single location for the originals was a liability. She divided the 247 pages into 3 groups. The most critical documents, the letter, the dual ledgers. 2 of the 3 forged deeds she wrapped in fresh oilcloth and placed inside a flour tin in the root cellar, buried under 2 inches of dry meal. The second group she sealed in a canvas pouch and hid behind a loose stone in the fireplace of the room she'd been using, which was cold this time of year and rarely tended. The third group, the affidavits and the supplementary records, she kept in the document box itself and replaced it in her trunk, because if someone searched the room and found the box, and found the least critical third of the evidence, she wanted them to feel they'd found everything. She had done this kind of dividing before. Not here, but in Missouri, in 2 different rooming houses, when she'd begun to understand that Roar's reach was longer than she'd initially mapped. She'd learned it the way she'd learned most things in those 4 years, by imagining the worst outcome first and working backward from it. When she came downstairs and found Rhett in the kitchen with his second coffee, he looked at her with the particular attention that had become habitual between them and said, "You moved the documents." She poured her own coffee. Yes. Where, she told him. All 3 locations. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The flour tin is good. The fireplace stone is good. The trunk they'll find in the first 10 minutes if they search." "That's the point," she said. He understood immediately, which was one of the things about him that had stopped surprising her and started being something she relied on. "They find the least important third and think they've won," he said. "And we have time." "Time for what?" "To get the rest out of the house entirely," she said. "Comes to that." He looked at his coffee. "You think it comes to that? I think we should plan as if it might." He nodded. This was one of the things they'd arrived at without negotiating it, a shared willingness to plan for the bad version rather than the hoped-for version. It wasn't pessimism. It was the particular pragmatism of 2 people who had both learned, through different routes, that hoping for the best while preparing only for the best was a good way to get caught. "I'll talk to Wade," he said. "There's a place in the upper timber, an old trapper's shelter, solid dry. Nobody from outside the ranch knows it's there." "That could work," she said. He stood. He had a full day ahead, and she could see it in the way he was already slightly somewhere else. The part of his mind that ran the ranch pulling at his attention, even as he was still in the kitchen. "Lenora," he said. She looked up. He seemed to be selecting words with unusual care. "Last night you said this fear has edges now, that it has a specific shape." He held his cup. "I want you to know that whatever shape it has, you're not the only one holding it." He left before she could answer. She stood in the kitchen with her coffee and the morning light coming in at an angle through the window, and she thought that Rhett Callaway was a much more complicated man than his mountain or his money or his silences suggested. And she thought that she had been right that night on the porch, when she'd felt something shift in her understanding of why she'd come here. She still wasn't sure if that was a good thing, but she was less afraid of it than she'd been a week ago. Shaw sent word on the 5th day after the fence was cut. The message was brief and coded in the way they'd arranged phrased as a routine supply inquiry, with specific words in specific positions that Lenora decoded at the desk while Rhett read over her shoulder. The formal complaint had been received and logged at the Territorial Administration in Ridgemont. Federal review had been initiated. Shaw had confirmed that at least 2 other ranching families in the broader territory had come forward with complaints that aligned with the Cascadia pattern, not the same level of documentation that Lenora's box contained, but corroborating in structure and timeline. The last line of the coded message, translated, read, "Movement on the Western Road. Be aware." Rhett read it twice and then went to find Wade. Lenora sat at the desk and thought about the Western Road. It was the main approach to the ranch from Black Pine Crossing, the road she'd come up on the stagecoach transfer the day she arrived. It was also the only road wide enough to bring a wagon or multiple riders up the mountain without crossing open terrain where they'd be visible for a long time before they arrived. There were 2 other ways onto the property, a narrow trail through the north timber that the ranch hands used to reach the upper pastures, which was passable on foot or on a single horse, but nothing wider, and the dry creek bed on the eastern edge, which was a scramble even in good conditions, and which Lenora had walked twice to understand its geography. She got up and went to the window. The yard was quiet. 2 hands were working near the smithy. One of the younger men was moving hay. Everything looked like an ordinary morning on a working ranch, which was exactly what made it feel wrong. The normalcies had the quality of a breath held, the stillness before a shift in weather. She went to find her coat. Rhett had the senior hands gathered in the barn within the hour. There were 7 of them Wade, and 6 men who had been on the ranch long enough and knew the mountain well enough that Rhett trusted them with the full situation. He told them about Shaw's message. He told them about the Western Road. He laid it out the same way he'd laid it out the week before, plainly, without softening, with the implicit respect of giving people the information they needed to make real decisions. "I'm not asking anyone to fight," he said. "What I'm asking for is awareness and communication. If you see something, you tell Wade or you tell me directly. Nobody engages with strangers on this property without one of us present. Nobody." He looked around the group. "The women and the younger hands stay near the main house until we know what we're dealing with." One of the hands, a broad-shouldered man named Cass Merritt, who had been on the ranch for 9 years, and whose general approach to most problems was the direct one, said, "If they come armed." Rhett didn't hesitate. "Then we're prepared for that." Cass nodded. It was the answer he'd wanted. Lenora was standing at the barn door. She hadn't been invited into the gathering, she'd simply come, because it seemed important to understand the full shape of the preparations, and nobody had asked her to leave. After the hands dispersed, she stayed. "I want to be part of the perimeter," she said to Rhett. He looked at her. "I know the eastern creek bed better than most of your hands do," she said. "I've walked it twice. I know which section is the most passable approach and which section looks passable but isn't." She met his look steadily. "I'm not going to stand in the main house while other people manage a risk I created." He opened his mouth. "I'm also," she said, "a better shot than you might expect." He closed his mouth. Wade, who was still in the barn, made a sound that was not quite a cough. "The eastern creek bed," Rhett said finally, with Cass. "Fine, you stay together. You don't engage independently." Understood. He looked at her for another moment. The particular look she'd come to understand was him recalibrating his assessment of her. Again, in the ongoing process of that recalibration that had been running since the day she'd dragged her own trunk off the stagecoach. "All right," he said. The next 2 days were the grinding kind. Kind where the waiting was active, watchful, physical, conducted in cold air on a mountain that did not care about the human dramas being played out across its terrain. Lenora walked the creekbed perimeter with Cass Merritt twice a day, morning and late afternoon. Cass was not a talker, which she appreciated. He was a watcher, the same way she was, and they developed a working rhythm, quickly a shared language of small signals, a nod for nothing to report, a specific stillness for something that needed attention. On the morning of the second day, he said to her, without preamble, "Rhett said you collected this evidence for 4 years. By yourself?" "Yes." Cass was quiet for a while, picking his way along the creek bank. "My father worked a property in Nevada that a land company tried to take. Different methods they ran the water off, fouled the wells upstream. The same idea." He looked ahead at the trail. He didn't have evidence. He just had his word against theirs. She didn't ask what happened. The way he said it told her enough. "The evidence matters," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm walking this creek with you." It was the closest thing to a statement of solidarity she'd received from anyone who wasn't Rhett or Wade, and it landed with more weight than he probably intended. They walked the rest of the circuit in the working quiet they'd developed. The attack came on the third night. Not at dawn, which was the expected time, the time that had military logic to it, the gray pre-light when visibility was uncertain, and defenders were at their lowest alertness. It came at midnight, which was either a miscalculation or a deliberate subversion of the expected pattern, and Lenora had been awake as she often was at midnight, which was the only reason she heard them before the first perimeter hand did. She heard horses. Not one or two, the sound was plural and careful, the specific sound of multiple horses being held at a walk by riders, who were trying to be quiet, which paradoxically made them louder to a trained ear than a single horse moving normally. She was up and dressed in under a minute. She had her rifle, a Winchester, she'd asked Rhett for on the second day after the fence cutting, and which he'd provided without commentary, and she moved to the window first, then to the hall. Rhett was already in the hall. He had the look of a man who hadn't been asleep either, and for a moment they were simply two people, standing in a dark hallway on a mountain, both fully dressed, both armed, both moving through the same information at the same speed. "Western Road," he said quietly. "And the creek," she said. "I heard more than 4 horses." He took that in. "Split approach."
"Yes."
He moved to wake Wade, who was in the bunkhouse. She moved to the window at the end of the hall that faced the eastern edge of the property. What happened in the next 2 hours was not clean. It was not the kind of confrontation that had a clear shape from inside it. It had a shape only later, when they could put the pieces together and understand what had been happening simultaneously in different parts of the dark property. From inside it, it was a series of compressed, urgent moments with too much darkness and too much noise, and too many decisions being made in the space of seconds by people who were scared and cold and trying to hold on to what they'd been told to hold on to. 4 men came up the Western Road. They were armed, and they were not trying to hide it past a certain point. Past the point where the ranch lights became visible, they abandoned subtlety and moved with the directness of men who had decided that speed was now more useful than stealth. Rhett and 2 of the senior hands met them in the yard. 2 more men came through the creek bed. Lenora and Cass were waiting for them. She had told Cass, during their second walk of the perimeter, which section of the creek approach she would take and which she'd leave for him, and he had absorbed this without argument in the way he absorbed most information directly, filed immediately, referenced when needed. When the 2 men came up the creek bank, they came through exactly the section she'd identified as the most passable approach. She was behind a stand of brush 20 feet back from the bank, and she had a clear line of sight. She did not fire first. She waited until they were fully up onto the flat ground above the bank, until she could see them clearly, and they had no remaining cover, and then she said loud and steady, the way she'd practiced in her mind, "Stop where you are and put the rifles down." One of them swung toward her voice immediately. She fired. Not at him, above him, the shot loud enough and close enough that the sound alone staggered him back 2 steps. Cass came out of the brush on the other side, and the 2 men found themselves flanked and standing in the open, and the calculation they ran through was quick and unfavorable. They put the rifles down. She kept hers up until Cass had them secured. Her hands were not steady. She noticed this without judgment. As a piece of information, her hands were shaking, and her heart was going at a rate that she could feel in her throat, and the taste in her mouth was the particular metallic taste of high fear, and none of this prevented her from doing what needed to be done. She'd learned somewhere in the 4 years that frightened and capable were not opposites, that you could be both at the same time, that the fear didn't have to stop unless you let it. She walked across the dark ground to where the men were and looked at them. She didn't recognize either of them from Missouri. They were hired men, the look of them said so. The look of men who did physical work for other people, without much investment in the reasons. One was young, maybe 25, with a cut above his ear from falling back against a rock when she'd fired. The other was older, 50 maybe, and was looking at the ground with the expression of a man who had run this particular calculation wrong and knew it. "Whose payroll are you on?" she said. Neither of them answered. She looked at the older one. "You're looking at federal charges. Trespassing on private property with intent at minimum. Probably more, depending on what your friends on the Western Road were planning." She kept her voice level. Talking now is the only variable you control. The older man looked up. He had the kind of face that had been on the wrong side of enough situations to have developed a realistic sense of when a situation was lost. He looked at her, at the rifle, at the steadiness she was maintaining, at Cass behind him, and said, "Sully." Just the name. She felt it land in her sternum. "Gareth Sully sent you," she said. "We were told to collect something." Didn't know the specifics. "The documents," she said. He didn't deny it. She looked at Cass. "Get them to the barn. I need to get to Rhett." The Western Road confrontation had been louder and less controlled. One of the 4 men had fired when Rhett's hands came out to meet them, a warning shot, probably, meant to create hesitation, and the shot had gone wide and struck the corner of the smithy, and the sound of it had been enormous in the mountain dark. Rhett's hands had responded, and 2 of Rohr's men had taken hits not fatal, but enough to stop the engagement. The other 2 had turned and ridden back down the Western Road at a pace that said they'd made a different kind of calculation than the 2 at the creek. By the time Lenora crossed the yard to where Rhett was standing, the immediate confrontation was over. He was uninjured. She saw this first and felt the relief of it before she catalogued the rest of the scene, the 2 men down near the fence line, one of his hands pressing a cloth to a graze on his own forearm, Wade moving through the yard with a lantern checking the buildings. Rhett saw her coming, and the particular quality of his attention when he looked at her was different from anything she'd seen on his face before. It was not the guarded's assessment of the early weeks or the controlled care of the middle ones. It was something rawer, the look of a man whose held breath had just released. "You're all right," he said. "Yes. Cass has 2 at the barn." She told him about Sully in 3 sentences. His jaw tightened personally. "He sent these men, which means he may not be far." She looked at the dark mountain around them. Or he held back to see what happened. Rhett turned and said something to Wade, and Wade immediately redirected 2 of the hands toward the tree line on the western edge. Then Rhett turned back to her. "The documents," he said. "Safe. All 3 locations intact. Nobody reached the house." Something moved through his face. "Good." And then, because he was Rhett and not a different kind of man, "You fired." "Warning shot," she said above. "Did it work?" "They put the rifles down." He looked at her for a moment in the lamplight of the yard, at the rifle in her hands, and the steadiness she was still maintaining by will, and he said, "I told you the Eastern Creek was the most likely approach." "You told me to watch it," she said. "I watched it." He exhaled. It was the sound of a man who had been managing something large and had just been allowed to set it down briefly. They had 4 men in custody, 2 at the barn, 2 wounded near the fence who were not going anywhere. Rhett sent a rider to Black Pine Crossing for Shaw before the night was another hour older. Shaw arrived at first light. He came with 2 deputies and covered the 20 miles from his base station in a time that said he'd been already moving, already watching the mountain, already expecting something. He looked at the 4 men, listened to Rhett's account, and then Lenora's, examined the scene at the creek bank, and said very little for a long time. Then he said Sully directed this. "The older man at the creek named him," Lenora said. "Sully naming himself is useful," Shaw said. "Sully being reachable is more useful." He looked at Rhett. "This escalates the investigation considerably. An armed incursion on a property connected to an open federal case is not something that can be managed quietly." He looked at the 2 wounded men being tended near the fence. "Rohr will have attorneys in Ridgemont within a day of this reaching him." "Good," Rhett said. Shaw looked at him. "You want him to lawyer up?" "I want him to feel like he's losing," Rhett said. "Desperate men make mistakes." Shaw almost smiled. He may also decide that the document problem requires a more direct solution. He sent 6 men to a mountain ranch in the dark, Lenora said. I'd say he's already operating in that register. Then we need to move faster than he does. Shaw looked between them. I want to transfer the original documents to federal custody. Today, if possible. Lenora thought about the flour tin in the root cellar, the stone in the fireplace, the document box in the trunk. All right, she said. But I want a written receipt. Itemized, every page. Shaw nodded. That's appropriate. And I want to be present when they're reviewed. In Ridgemont, when the time comes. This is my case. It's a federal case, Shaw said. Start it as mine, she said. You have 247 pages, because I spent 4 years collecting them. I want to be present. Shaw looked at Rhett, which she noticed and did not appreciate, and Rhett looked at her and not at Shaw when he said, She'll be present. That's not negotiable. Shaw accepted this. I'll have the receipt prepared this morning. The handover took most of the morning. She brought out the 3 sections of documents one at a time and laid them on the desk in Rhett's office, while Shaw's clerk through each page, recording it, and Shaw reviewed the key documents with the focused attention she'd come to associate with the way he operated, quiet, thorough, not given to visible reactions, even when what he was reading clearly moved him. He read the letter in Rohr's handwriting twice. He read the dual ledger pages 3 times. When he looked up from the forged deeds, his expression had a quality she recognized, the specific tightness of a careful man confronting evidence that was better than he'd expected. This is enough, he said. Not to her, almost to himself. Told you it was, she said. You told me it might be. He straightened the pages. This is definitively enough. The letter alone, in context of the deeds, he stopped. He's going to prison. If we can get this in front of the right judge without it being interfered with, Augustus Rohr is going to prison. The room was quiet for a moment. Lenora had thought about this moment many times in 4 years. She had imagined what it would feel like to hear those words, or words like them, from someone in a position to mean them. She had imagined it would feel like relief, or triumph, or the particular release of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time. What she actually felt was complicated. There was relief, yes. But underneath it was the specific grief of everything the 4 years had cost, not the work. She didn't regret the work, but the years themselves. Her 20s, mostly. The friends she hadn't made and the places she hadn't stayed, and the life she hadn't been able to build because she'd been carrying this instead. She felt Rhett's presence at the edge of the room, without turning to look at him. What happens next, she said to Shaw practically. The documents go to Ridgemont today, in federal custody. I'll be filing an expanded complaint by the end of the week. Rohr's attorneys will be notified that's legally required, and at that point it becomes a race between the formal process and whatever Rohr tries to do to slow it down. Shaw looked at her. He will try to slow it down. He has resources and people who have reasons to help him. I know, she said. The 6 men from last night, they're a problem for him, not just for us. 2 of them are going to talk. They always do when the alternative is federal time. Shaw gathered his papers. Sully is the variable. If we can find Sully before Rohr pulls him out of reach. Sully won't be easy to find, Lenora said. He's been Rohr's instrument for years. He knows how to disappear. Everyone knows how to disappear until they don't, Shaw said. He stood and looked at Rhett. You've been generous with this ranch. With your resources, your people, your time. It's my land they were threatening too, Rhett said. Through the Cascadia group. Through whatever mechanism. Yes. He was standing with his arms crossed, not aggressive, settled. The body language of a man who had been living on a mountain for 12 years and had no particular interest in looking smaller than he was. I have a stake in this. You do, Shaw agreed. He picked up the document box, which now held the carefully counted and receipted 247 pages, plus the clerk's documentation of each one. He held it in both hands with a kind of care that Lenora noticed and appreciated. I'll be in contact, he left. The room was quieter without him. The 2 deputies, the clerk, the particular official weight of the federal presence, all of it withdrew down the western road, and what was left was the ranch. And the mountain, and the people who lived and worked on it. Lenora stood at the desk. The surface of it was clear now. For the first time since she'd arrived, there were no documents spread across it, no evidence to organize, no copies to make, no summary pages to write. Just the plain wood surface, and the morning light, and the empty space, where 247 pages had lived for 4 years, and now didn't. She put her hand flat on the desk. Rhett came and stood beside her, not close, but present, in the way he was present when he brought coffee in the mornings. Not requiring anything. Just there. It's out of your hands now, he said. Mostly, she said. Is that harder or easier? She thought about it honestly. Both, she said. It's both at once, and I don't know the proportions yet. He was quiet for a moment. When my father died, I was 22, and he left me this ranch. I spent the first year trying to control everything. Every decision, every variable, every outcome. And Wade finally said to me. He stopped, seemed to decide something. Wade said, "You can manage a ranch, or you can manage your fear of losing it, but you can't do both at the same time." He looked at the clear desk surface. I didn't understand what he meant for about 2 more years. And then one day I did. She looked at him sideways. What did he mean? That the fear costs the same energy as the work, but the work is the only one of them that accomplishes anything. He turned toward the window. The documents are with Shaw. Roar has lawyers, and they're moving. We can't change the speed of the federal process. He looked at her. So what we can manage right now is what's in front of us. The ranch. The people on it. The families in this valley who are going to need someone to stand up before this is over. She understood what he was telling her. He was telling her the next part without calling it the next part. You want to go public, she said. I want the valley to know what Cascadia is, he said. Before Roar's attorneys spin this into something that sounds like a property dispute between 2 business interests. He looked at her. They'll try to frame it that way. A wealthy Missouri land operator versus a wealthy mountain rancher, disagreeing over water rights and property lines. They'll strip out the 11 families and the forged deeds and the people who lost everything, and they'll make it look like a commercial quarrel. Unless the community already knows the shape of it, she said. Yes. She thought about this. About the risk of it going public before the federal process had progressed meant Roar's attorneys would know exactly what narrative they were countering, and they were good at their jobs. It meant exposing herself more fully, putting her account and her credibility into a space where Roar could attack them directly. And it meant trusting people she didn't know yet. The families of Black Pine Crossing and the broader valley. People who might be sympathetic or might not, who might stand or might not, who were not abstractions but actual human beings with their own interests and their own fears. She had spent 4 years trusting almost no one. She looked at the clear desk surface. When? She said. Saturday, he said. There's a regular gathering at the Crossing ranching families, merchants, everyone comes in for supplies. Place. The right number of people. And you'll speak. We'll speak, he said, not he. We, she looked at him. You know this case better than I do, he said. You know the people it hurt. You know the pattern of how it operates. He met her look with the directness that had stopped feeling like assessment and started feeling like something else. I know this valley. Between us we have the whole picture. She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the farmhouse door swinging open, about her father's gray face, about the 247 pages she'd carried for 4 years in a box wrapped in oilcloth, about the 11 families and the 2 elderly ones who hadn't survived the loss of their land, about Gareth Sully's name in the dark by a creek bed on a mountain she hadn't heard of 6 weeks ago. All right, she said. Saturday. She didn't say anything else. Turned from the desk and walked to the window and looked out at the yard, and the mountain beyond it, the mountain that was not hers, and that had not been her plan, and that had become, in some way she hadn't finished accounting for, the first place in 4 years where she had felt the specific weight of being somewhere she might stay. The morning was clear and cold. The mountain was very large, and they had a great deal still to do. The ride down the mountain on Saturday morning was cold. Lenora sat beside Rhett on the wagon bench with her coat buttoned to the throat and watched the valley open up below them as they descended the switchbacks. The town of Black Pine Crossing becoming visible in stages, first the church steeple, then the rooftops, then the full spread of the main street with its Saturday morning activity already underway. Wagons lined up outside the general store, horses at the livery rail, children moving between the adults' legs with the particular purposeful randomness of children who have been given no specific instructions and are taking full advantage of it. She had not slept well. This was not new, but the reason was different from the usual reasons. The fear had been her sleepless companion for 4 years, and she knew its texture well enough to distinguish it from other things. What had kept her awake the night before was not fear exactly. It was the particular alertness of someone standing at the edge of something they can't fully predict, looking down at the drop and calculating whether the calculation they've run is actually right, or whether they've missed a variable. She had run the calculation many times, go public. Get ahead of Roar's framing. Give the valley the shape of the thing before his attorneys arrived to reshape it. Trust the community. Trust the community. That was the variable she kept returning to. Rhett had said on the way down, some of these families have known me for 12 years. They don't all like me. I'm not always easy to like. He'd said it without self-pity, which was how he said most true things about himself. But they know I don't lie, and they know I don't panic. If I stand up and say this is real, most of them will take that seriously. She had nodded. The ones who don't, he'd said, we can't do anything about. She had nodded again. What she hadn't said was, it's not the ones who don't believe you that I'm worried about. It's the ones who believe you and still don't act. The ones who understand perfectly well what's happening and decide that the risk of standing against a man like Roar is larger than the cost of not standing. She had seen that calculation run before, in Missouri, in the early days when she'd been gathering affidavits. She'd seen good people she respected, people who were not cowards in any ordinary sense, look at what Roar had done, and then look at what standing against Roar would cost them, and choose the version of the future where they stayed quiet. She understood that choice. She didn't judge it. She just hoped it didn't happen today. Wade had come down the mountain an hour ahead of them to take the temperature of the crowd before they arrived, which was the kind of thing Wade did without being asked. He'd been doing it for Rhett for years, moving ahead into rooms and situations, reading them, coming back with the information Rhett needed to walk in prepared. They found him outside the general store when the wagon pulled up. He came to the wagon side and said quietly, "Garrison Holt is here." Rhett's face changed, not much, but Lenora caught it. "Who is Garrison Holt?" she asked. "He owns the largest independent trading operation in the valley," Rhett said, climbing down. "He's also connected to the Territorial Commerce Board in Ridgemont." He extended a hand to help her down, and she took it, which she might not have done 2 weeks ago. "If Roar has a sympathetic ear in this valley, it's Holt." "How sympathetic?" "Unknown," Wade said. "He hasn't declared himself on anything yet. But he's been having a lot of conversations with people from Ridgemont this past month, and at least 2 of those people have Cascadia connections. Process this. Is he here because he heard we were coming?" "Probably," Wade said. "Good," she said. Both men looked at her. "If he's watching, he's worried," she said. "Worried people are paying attention. Paying attention is what we need right now." Rhett looked at Wade. Wade made the almost smile that was his version of an actual smile. "All right," Rhett said. "Let's go." The gathering happened in the open space beside the saloon, which served as the de facto town meeting ground when the weather permitted, and the subject required more than a counter-conversation at the general store. Word had moved through the valley the way. Word moved in small territories, not formally, not by announcement, through the specific velocity of people who sensed that something was happening and passed that sensing along until it became a general awareness that Saturday was worth being present for. There were perhaps 60 people when Rhett climbed onto the flatbed wagon that served as a speaking platform. More came while he was talking, drawn from the street and the store and the livery by the sound of his voice carrying across the open ground. Lenora stood at the edge of the crowd, not on the wagon. They'd discussed this. Rhett would speak first, the known quantity, the 12-year presence on this mountain, the man whose word the valley had learned to weigh over a long time. She would speak after, if the room warranted it. If it didn't, her speaking would only give Roar's people more to work with. She watched faces while Rhett talked. He was not a natural public speaker in the oratorical sense. He didn't have the preacher's rhythm or the politician's ease, the sense of performance that turned a crowd into an audience. What he had was something more useful in this context. He spoke the way he worked, directly, without ornament, with the specific weight of a man who chose his words because he meant them and not for any other reason. He told the valley about the Cascadia Territorial Group. He told them about the Eastern Tributary and the water rights discrepancy, and the 2 ranches that had sold out below value in the previous 2 years. He told them about the attack on his ranch, 6 men in the dark, 2 approaches, a cut fence, and he told them that 4 of those men were now in federal custody and had named Gareth Sully as the man who'd sent them. He didn't mention Lenora until the end of that section, and when he did, he simply said, "The person who identified the Cascadia connection, who built the evidence that's now in federal custody, is someone who came to this valley 6 weeks ago. She's been carrying this information for 4 years alone, and she gave it to the right people when she had reason to trust them." He looked across the crowd. "She's here today." and what she has to say is worth hearing. He stepped down. She stepped up. She had not prepared a speech. She had decided against a speech because a speech was a performance, and a performance could be dismantled as performance. And what she needed from this crowd was not their admiration but their belief. Belief required a different kind of speaking, the kind that came from the same place as the work, the same internal register as sitting alone in a filing room at midnight, copying documents by lamplight with one ear on the hallway. She stood on the flatbed wagon and looked at 60-something faces looking back at her. And she said, "I grew up in Missouri. My father was a farmer. He made mistakes, he borrowed money he couldn't repay, and he trusted people he shouldn't have trusted. And Augustus Rohr used those mistakes as a door." She paused. Not for effect. Because she was finding the right words, and she didn't rush that even with 60 people watching. He walked through that door and he took our land. He did it with forged documents and bribed officials and a legal process that was designed to look legitimate right up until it wasn't, by which point it was too late to stop. Crowd was quiet. He did the same thing to 10 other families in Missouri that I can document by name, probably more that I couldn't reach. She looked across the faces. He's been doing the same thing here. Different name on the company, different men at the front of it. Same structure, same methods, same intended outcome. She let that sit for a moment. The evidence is in federal custody now. Marshal Shaw has it. The investigation is open, and it's real, and it has enough behind it that the outcome, if we don't let it get interfered with, is a federal trial and a conviction. A voice from the crowd, if. She found the face. A man about 50, solid, wearing the clothes of someone who dealt in commerce rather than land work. Garrison Holt, she assumed without confirmation, if, she agreed. A man with Rohr's resources will spend considerable money trying to slow this down, discredit the evidence, and discredit me. He'll argue I'm a desperate woman with a complicated history and a grudge. He'll argue that the evidence is circumstantial or fabricated or both. She looked at Holt steadily. And some of that will land with some people. That's how these things work. Holt said, "What do you want from us?" "Witnesses," she said. "Anyone in this valley who has had contact with the Cascadia group, any approach, any pressure, any offer to buy it below value, any hint of legal threat over water or boundary, I want to hear it. On record, in whatever form Marshal Shaw will accept." She looked around the broader crowd. "And I want you to know what this is before Rohr's attorneys arrive and tell you a different version of it. Because they will arrive. They'll come with paperwork and official language and the particular confidence of people who have done this before and gotten away with it." She paused. They haven't done it in front of a federal case this well documented before. The silence after this was a different quality from the silence at the beginning. It was the silence of people running their own calculations. Then a woman spoke from the left side of the crowd. She was maybe 60, weathered in the way of people who had lived their whole lives at elevation, and her voice was steady and without any performance in it. "The Cascadia people came to our place 3 months ago, offered to buy our east quarter, said the water situation was going to make things difficult for small operations and we'd be better off taking their price." She looked at Lenora. "We said no. They said we'd reconsider." Another voice, "They came to us too." And another. Not the whole crowd. Not even most of it. But enough 5, then 7, then 9 people who had a story that rhymed with hers in one way or another. People who had been approached, pressured, or watched. People who had felt the particular chill of a large interest moving in their direction and hadn't had a name for what it was until today. Lenora stood on the flatbed wagon and listened to each one, and she felt something accumulate in the crowd, not anger, exactly, though there was anger in it. Something more structural. The specific shift that happens in a group of people when they understand that what they thought was their private problem is actually a shared one, and that the sharing changes the math. Garrison Holt had not spoken again. She found his face in the crowd, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't read cleanly, not hostile, but not open. The expression of a man who had made a calculation and wasn't yet committed to it. She held his look for a moment. Then she stepped down from the wagon. Rhett found her afterward, on the far side of the saloon building where the crowd had thinned to nothing. He came around the corner and handed her a cup of water and stood with his back against the wall beside her. 9, he said. Plus 3 who spoke to Wade privately and didn't want to say it in front of the group. 12, she said. Plus the ranches that already sold. Shaw can work with 12. Shaw can do a great deal with 12. She drank the water. Her throat was dry in the way it got when she'd been talking steadily, thinking steadily. holding everything in exactly the right arrangement for an extended period. Holt didn't commit. No, Rhett said. Do you know which way he leans? Rhett was quiet for a moment. He had his arms crossed, and he was looking at the ground the way he looked at the mountain, reading it. Holt is a practical man. He built what he has by reading which way things were going and positioning accordingly. He looked up. He'll watch for another week or two. See how the federal process moves. See if Roar has a response. And then he'll come down on the winning side, she said. Probably. That's not the worst outcome, she said. The winning side is ours. Rhett looked at her sideways. There was something in his expression that was new or not new exactly, but more visible than it had been. Like something that had been present for a while was less interested in staying contained. You were right, he said. She waited. About going public. About the timing. About how to say it, he paused. I've been running this ranch for 12 years, and I've made a lot of decisions about how to handle things, and I get them right more often than not. But he stopped. Tried again. You see things I don't. The way you read that crowd while you were talking. The way you held Holt's look. You were making calculations in real time that I wouldn't have known to make. You were making ones I couldn't, she said. The history. The names. The 12 years of knowing which faces mattered and why. She looked at him. We needed both. He was quiet for a moment. That's true, he said. We did. The word sat between them with a specific gravity. Not romantic, not precisely, but weighted with something that was adjacent to it, something in the same family. The particular recognition of two people who have discovered that they are more useful, more complete, more able to function in the specific way they need to function when they are operating together rather than separately. She looked at the wall across the alley. He looked at his boots. Neither of them said the thing that was in the air between them, because neither of them was ready to say it, and they both knew it, and the not saying felt, somehow, like a form of respect for the thing itself. We should get back, she said. I want to write to Shaw today about the 12 witnesses. All right, he said. They walked back to the wagon. Shaw's response came 5 days later, and it was better than she'd hoped. The 12 witnesses, the 9 who had spoken publicly, and the 3 who had spoken privately to Wade, had been formally contacted by a federal deputy. 7 of them had agreed to provide written statements. Shaw wrote that the addition of the witness accounts, combined with the documentary evidence already in federal custody, had moved the investigation from preliminary to active, which in federal process terms meant that a formal indictment was being prepared. He also wrote, in the careful coded language they used, Sully located. Eastern Territory, secure. Lenora read this, standing at the desk, and had to sit down. Rhett, who had been watching her face while she read, said, good or bad? They found Sully, she said. He went still. In custody, she said. Eastern Territory, which means he hadn't made it back to Missouri. She looked at Rhett. Without Sully, Roar's network in this territory has no operational head. He can still work through attorneys and official channels, but his ability to do what he did at the ranch, that's gone. For now, Rhett said. For now, she agreed. But the indictment is coming. Shaw says formal, which means a grand jury has already reviewed the preliminary evidence. She set the letter down. This is moving, Rhett. This is actually moving. He looked at her and she looked at him, and between them was the specific silence of two people who have been in a hard situation together for long enough that good news lands not as simple joy, but as something more complex relief, mixed with the residue of all the fear that preceded it. The way light feels almost painful when you've been in the dark for a long time. Mrs. Dupree is going to be insufferable, he said. She's been wanting a reason to make that spiced cake she saves for significant occasions. Lenora laughed, again the short surprise sound. Again the flicker across his face. Let her make it, Lenora said. I was planning to, he said. The indictment came 11 days later. It was formal and federal, and its language was dry the way legal language is dry, the desert of official prose. The thirst of reading a document that describes enormous human damage in the vocabulary of administrative process. The substance of it was not dry. The substance of it was the Bellamy farmhouse door swinging open. It was 11 families named by property location and date of loss. It was the dual ledgers and the forged deeds, and the letter in Roar's handwriting, entered into the federal record with their full provenance. Augustus Roar was charged with land fraud, document forgery, conspiracy to defraud, criminal intimidation, and in connection with the attack on the Callaway Ranch, conspiracy to commit violence against witnesses in a federal investigation. His attorneys filed a response within 48 hours. It was everything Lenora had told the town it would be. Rohr was a legitimate businessman, the victim of a coordinated campaign by rival commercial interests. The documents had been fabricated or misrepresented. Lenora Bellamy was a woman with a personal grievance and a troubled family history, acting in coordination with a powerful territorial rancher who had his own commercial reasons for opposing the Cascadia Group's legitimate expansion. It was well constructed. She read it carefully twice and identified 4 specific points where it was genuinely effective places where the language created a version of events that was internally consistent if you didn't know what she knew, places where a juror who came in without context might find purchase. She gave Rhett the analysis. He read it sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, and when he finished, he sat down and said, "They're going after your father's debt." "Yes," she said. "The argument is that my father's borrowing was predatory toward Rohr's business partners, that Rohr was actually a victim of the Bellamy family's financial mismanagement and pursued legitimate legal remedies. Is there any world in which that holds up against the forged deeds?" "No," she said. "But it doesn't have to hold up against the full evidence. It only has to hold up long enough to create reasonable doubt in one juror's mind." She sat across from him. "The forged deeds are the answer to it. The deeds and the dual ledgers together make it impossible to sustain the argument that Rohr's methods were legitimate. But we need to get to the point in the trial where the jury has seen both before the defense narrative calcifies." He was looking at her with the focused attention she'd come to think of as his reading looked the way he read The Mountain, the way he read A Difficult Horse, the way he read a situation he was taking seriously. "Shaw needs to know this," he said. "I've already written it down," she said. "I want to send it with a writer today. Use Cord Pickett. I was going to ask you about that." He stood and went to send for Cord. The trial date was set for 6 weeks out. 6 weeks was both long and short long, in the way that waiting is always long, when the stakes are this specific, short in the way that the preparation required compressed every day to its limit. Shaw wanted Lenora in Ridgemont for a pretrial consultation in the 3rd week. He wanted her testimony prepared, her role in the evidence collection documented, her response to the defense's characterization of her developed in explicit, quotable terms that could be referenced during trial. She spent 2 weeks in preparation that was methodical and draining in the specific way that revisiting the past at high resolution is always draining not the events themselves, but the requirement to reconstruct them accurately, to hold every detail in the right order, to be able to account for every decision she'd made over 4 years in language that would hold up under adversarial questioning. Rhett was there during most of it. Not directing, he wasn't in a position to direct, but present in the way he'd been present throughout. The way she'd come to rely on more than she'd admitted to herself. He made coffee. He listened when she talked through the timeline. He asked questions, sometimes precise, practical questions that helped her identify the places in her account where the logic was less than airtight. On the 4th evening of the preparation week, she made a mistake. She was working through the timeline of the ledger discovery the night she'd stayed late in Rohr's office, the file cabinet, the duplicate key, and she got a detail wrong. A date. She put the discovery of the dual ledgers 2 months earlier than it had actually happened, which created a timeline problem that would have been visible to a competent opposing counsel. Caught it herself, about 3 minutes after she'd said it. Stopped talking. Rhett waited. "I got the date wrong," she said. "The ledger discovery was October, not August." She pressed her fingers against her forehead. "If I'd said that in front of opposing counsel—" "You're not in front of opposing counsel," he said. "I know, but—" "Lenora." He said it in the particular way he said her name when he wanted her to stop the spiral before it fully started, not harsh, just direct. "You caught it. That's the point of the preparation. I've had these dates correct for 4 years, she said. I've never mixed them up. You've also never had 6 weeks of sustained high-pressure preparation, followed by a trial at the end of it, he said. You're tired. You mixed up 2 dates. Write the correct one down, note where the confusion came from, and move on. She looked at him. I'm not being dismissive, he said. I'm being accurate. The mistake is correctable. Sitting here cataloging it is not correctable. It's just time you're spending on something that doesn't help. She exhaled. Write the date down, he said. She wrote it down. Continued. The morning they left for Ridgemont, the ranch felt different. She noticed it in the particular way. She noticed things that she hadn't registered consciously until they were about to change the specific quality of the morning light in the kitchen. The sound of the hands starting work in the yard, Mrs. Dupree's kitchen movements that had become as familiar as background music over 6 weeks on this mountain. She had a trunk again. Not the original one that had stayed, with her things still in it. This was a smaller travel case, packed for 2 weeks in Ridgemont, the minimum required for the pre-trial work and the trial itself. Rhett was taking the wagon. Wade was staying to manage the ranch. The goodbye between Rhett and Wade was the goodbye of men who had worked together long enough that they didn't need to say much. Wade handed Rhett a list of things that needed attention in his absence. Rhett read it, asked one question about the north pasture fence, and folded the list into his coat pocket. They shook hands, that was all. Wade turned to Lenora. He held out his hand. She took it. "Come back," he said. Simple as that. She understood what he meant. Not just from Ridgemont, from the broader situation. Come back and still be here, on the other side of it. Plan to, she said. It was more of a commitment than it sounded like, and they both knew it. Ridgemont was a territorial capital, and it felt like one larger, louder, more compressed, with the particular energy of a place where official power and commercial power, and the friction between them, had been generating heat for a long time. Lenora watched it come into view as they descended from the mountain pass and thought, as she sometimes thought about places like this, that you could read the whole politics of a territory by the layout of a capital, where the lawyers' offices were relative to the courts, where the banks were relative to both. Shaw had arranged rooms at a boarding house 3 streets from the federal courthouse. Clean, practical, nothing more. He met them there the evening they arrived and spent 2 hours with Lenora going through the pre-trial structure. The trial would take 5 days, minimum, possibly 7. The prosecution's case would open with the documentary evidence, the deeds, the ledgers, the letter, and build the structural argument before calling witnesses. Lenora would testify in the 3rd day, after the documents had been established. Shaw wanted her testimony to personalize what the documents proved, to give the jury the human dimension of what the numbers and the legal language described. They will try to make you angry, he said. Roar's attorney, his name is Pressman, Aldous Pressman, and he's been doing this for 30 years. He will try to make you angry, or make you cry, or make you look unstable. Any of those outcomes helps him. I know, she said. I'm not saying you can't handle it. I'm saying be ready for it to be worse than you expect. She looked at him. Marshal, I spent 4 years collecting evidence against a man who employed people whose job it was to find me. I'm fairly difficult to destabilize. Shaw looked at Rhett. Rhett looked at Lenora. She is, he said simply. Shaw accepted this. They worked for 2 more hours, and then Shaw left, and the boarding house was quiet, and Lenora sat at the small writing desk in her room and felt the particular weight of the moment, the accumulated 6 weeks on the mountain, the 4 years before that, all of it converging on 5 to 7 days in a courtroom 3 streets away. There was a knock at her door. Rhett. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the kitchen downstairs. He handed her one through the doorway. He didn't come in the propriety of, that was not something either of them would override casually, but he stood in the doorway and looked at her with the directness that had always been one of his most identifiable qualities. How are you, he said. Not as a courtesy, as an actual question requiring an actual answer. She thought about it. Ready, she said, and scared. She stopped, and she looked at him. Grateful, she said, that I'm not doing this the way I did the last 4 years. Alone. Something moved through his face that she didn't look away from this time. You're not, he said. He stayed in the doorway for another moment. Then he said, get some sleep, I will, she said. He left. She sat with her coffee and listened to the sounds of Ridgemont settling into its night, different from the mountain, louder, more human, lacking the mountain's immense, indifferent quiet. And she thought about Wade saying, come back, and about what coming back would mean, and what shape the life on the other side of this might have, if she let herself begin to construct it. She was still afraid to construct it fully, but she was less afraid than she had been. She drank her coffee and went over the timeline one more time, and this time the dates were right. The trial opened on a Tuesday. The courtroom in Ridgemont's federal building was smaller than she'd expected, and more formal than the space-warranted dark wood paneling, high windows that let in a gray territorial light, benches on the public side that were already half full when Lenora arrived with Shaw and Rhett at 8 in the morning. Augustus Roar was already seated at the defense table. She had not seen him in 4 years. She had last seen him, in person, in the hallway of his Caldwell office building, a chance sighting from a distance, before he knew what she had, before Sully had found the key. He had looked then like what he was, a man in his late 50s who had accumulated enough to believe that accumulation was its own justification. Well-dressed, deliberate. The kind of man who moved through rooms with the expectation that the rooms would adjust around him. He looked the same now. She had expected him to look diminished by the circumstances, by the federal charges, by the courtroom, by the presence of the evidence in the files on the prosecution table. He didn't. He sat with the same deliberate composure, talking quietly to the man beside him who would be Aldous Pressman, and he did not look at the room the way a man looks at a room he's afraid of. This told her something. He was still confident, or performing confidence, which at this level amounted to the same thing. She sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table and breathed carefully and reminded herself of what she knew, that confidence was not the same as invulnerability, that Rohr had been confident the whole time she was collecting the evidence, that the confidence of a man who believes he cannot be reached is not a reliable indicator of whether he can be reached. Rhett sat beside her. His shoulder was 3 inches from hers. Neither of them moved away from the gap. When the judge entered and the room rose, she rose with it, and she looked at the prosecution table, where 247 pages, 4 years of her life, the cost of her family's land, and a great deal more were assembled in orderly folders, and she thought, let's see how confident he is in 5 days. Pressman was good. She had prepared for good, and he was better than good. He was the particular variety of excellent that comes from decades of doing one specific thing in high-stakes conditions, smooth without being oily, aggressive without being visible about it, skilled at the kind of questioning that left just enough ambiguity in the air for a jury to breathe it in without noticing. His opening statement reframed the case exactly as she'd predicted to Rhett at the kitchen table. Not fraud, but commerce. Not a scheme, but a legitimate land acquisition operation that had unfortunately attracted the obsessive attention of a woman with a personal grievance and a wealthy ally with commercial interests in blocking Cascadia's territorial expansion. She watched the jury during Pressman's opening. 12 faces, the usual range of attention and inattention, skepticism and openness. 2 of them she marked a man in the second row who leaned forward when Pressman emphasized the word obsessive, and a woman in the corner seat who had looked at the prosecution's evidence folders when they were brought in and then looked away quickly, which was the look of someone trying not to be caught looking. She noted both. Prosecution's opening was steadier and less theatrical. Shaw's deputy, a young attorney named Carver, who was precise and disciplined, if not brilliant, and it laid the structural argument correctly in the order she and Shaw had planned. First 2 days of evidence were documentation. She sat and watched the deeds go in, and the ledgers go in, and the letter go in, and she listened to Pressman's cross-examinations of the records officers who authenticated the documents, and she watched him work at the edges of the authenticity question, with the patience of a man who knew he couldn't break the documents themselves, but was trying to create friction around their handling, their provenance, their chain of custody. He almost succeeded on the second day, with a question about the filing sequence of the authenticated copies, a technical question about which copy had been logged when, which created a 2-hour recess while the records were re-examined, the documents held. But the 2 hours had existed, and Pressman had put the question in the jury's air. She told Rhett, in the boarding house that evening, he's not trying to win on the documents. Can't. He's trying to create enough texture around them that the jury doesn't fully trust any single piece. Does it work? Sometimes, she said. With a jury that hasn't been shown a clear enough narrative, she looked at the ceiling. Tomorrow the witnesses start. If the witnesses hold, the texture won't be enough. 7 of the 12 Valley witnesses held completely. 2 had minor inconsistencies in their accounts that Pressman exploited with precision, pulling at threads in a way that was technically within the facts, but created an impression of sloppiness. The remaining 3 were solid, particularly a ranching woman named Dorothea Crane, who had been approached by Cascadia 8 months prior and had kept the letter they'd sent her, which she produced from her coat pocket in the witness stand and handed to the court clerk with a composed certainty that Pressman could not find a way to attack. Lenora watched Dorothea Crane hand over that letter and felt something move through her chest that was close to love, in the specific form love takes when it is not personal but is still real. Testified on the 3rd day. She had thought about this moment many times. She had run through it in her head, anticipated the questions, calibrated her responses. She had done everything that preparation could do. And then she sat in the witness chair, and Pressman stood up to cross-examine her, and none of the preparation quite covered the specific reality of the man. He was patient with her. That was the first surprise. She had expected aggression, the courtroom aggression of someone trying to make her lose her composure, and what she got instead was a kind of careful, even respectful questioning that was somehow more unsettling. He walked her through the 4 years, question by question, date by date. He was interested in every moment of uncertainty, every decision she'd made alone, every person who had known what she was doing and had not joined her. He built slowly a picture of a woman who had been operating in isolation, making unilateral judgments about evidence, deciding on her own what the evidence meant and where it should go. It was not a false picture. That was what made it effective. It was a true picture, just arranged to look like something other than what it was. He asked about her father. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it. Your father's financial difficulties, Pressman said. These were substantial? Yes. He borrowed money he couldn't repay.
Yes.
From multiple parties.
Yes.
One of those parties was connected to Mr. Rohr's business network. Through Rohr's deliberate construction of the debt situation, yes. You believe Mr. Rohr deliberately created the conditions for your father's default. I documented it, she said. That's not a belief. It's in the ledgers. Pressman paused, just briefly. You were very close to your father. Yes. His loss of the property affected your family profoundly. Yes. And you spent 4 years pursuing this investigation while living in circumstances that were, he consulted a paper, financially difficult. Moving between locations, working temporary positions. Yes. That's a significant personal cost for something that began as your family's private misfortune. She looked at him. She was aware of the jury. She was aware of Rhett in the gallery. She was aware of all of it, and she set all of it to the side. My family's situation was where I started, she said. It's not where I ended. The evidence in those files represents 11 families whose situations were structurally identical to ours. The only person it had happened to was my father. I would still have documented it. But it wasn't the only person. You decided that, Pressman said. On your own. You decided the scope of the investigation. Someone had to, she said. A sound in the gallery. Small, the judge looked up. Pressman let the moment sit. Miss Bellamy, isn't it possible that your personal grievance has shaped the way you've interpreted evidence that might have other explanations? She had prepared for this question specifically. She said, it's possible. That's why I collected 247 pages over 4 years instead of going to the authorities with my personal grievance. I didn't trust my grievance. I trusted the documents. She looked directly at him. If you can find an explanation for a forged deed that doesn't involve forgery, I'd genuinely like to hear it. Another sound in the gallery. The judge said nothing this time. Pressman moved on. He was at her for 2.5 hours. At the end of it, she was tired in a way that went past physical, the specific depletion of having been scrutinized at high intensity for an extended time, of having held every word to the same standard for 2.5 hours without a break. She had held. She was certain of that, not triumphant certain. The way you are certain of something you verified carefully rather than something you merely hope. When she stepped down from the witness stand and returned to her seat in the gallery, Rhett was watching her with an expression that was everything he didn't say out loud, which was a considerable amount. He said nothing. She sat down. His hand on the bench between them moved 2 inches toward hers and stopped there. She moved hers the same distance. They didn't touch. But the gap between their hands on that courtroom bench was a different kind of space than any gap between them had been before. She looked at the front of the courtroom. 2 more days. She was ready for 2 more days. The 4th day of the trial was the one that broke it open. Not dramatically, not in the way trials break open in stories, with a single revelation that silences the room and turns every face in the same direction. It broke open the way real things break, gradually, then all at once, through the accumulation of details that individually seemed manageable and collectively became impossible to hold. Gareth Sully testified for the prosecution. Shaw had negotiated this over the course of 3 weeks, a reduced charge in exchange for full cooperation, the kind of arrangement that defense attorneys always protest and juries always understand. Sully was not a sympathetic figure. Compact, careful man who had spent 15 years being Rohr's instrument and had the specific quality of someone who had done things he knew were wrong and had filed that knowledge in a compartment he rarely opened. He testified without visible remorse, which was actually more credible than visible remorse would have been. It was the testimony of a man who was being accurate, because accuracy was now in his interest, not because he felt particularly bad about any of it. He confirmed the attack on the Callaway ranch. He confirmed the names of the 6 men he'd sent. He confirmed that the directive had come from Rohr, directly, not through an intermediary, not through a business communication that could be interpreted as something other than what it was, but directly. In a conversation Sully described in specific enough detail that Pressman could not find a way to argue it hadn't happened. He also confirmed something Lenora had suspected, but not been able to document. Rohr had known about her before she left Missouri. Not about the documents specifically. Sully said Rohr hadn't known the full extent of what she'd collected until after Sully found the duplicate key. But Rohr had known she was watching. He'd known she was asking questions in the wrong directions for a woman who was supposed to be doing clerical work, and he'd told Sully to manage the situation. Sully's version of managing the situation had been to find the key and arrange for her to leave quickly, expecting her to run without whatever she'd collected. He hadn't expected 247 pages. He said this plainly, in the particular tone of a man who could admit a miscalculation with more ease than he could admit a moral failure. We thought she'd have copies of a few things, not a complete parallel record going back 4 years. Pressman's cross-examination of Sully was the best work he did in the entire trial. He was aggressive in a way he hadn't been with Lenora, openly aggressive, pulling at every inconsistency in Sully's account, attacking his credibility as a cooperating witness, building the argument that a man who had made a deal to reduce his own charges would say whatever was required of him. It was effective work. 2 of the jurors she'd been watching shifted in their seats during it, the particular shift of people who are holding 2 versions of events and haven't yet decided which one to set down. But then Carver on redirect asked Sully one question. He asked, "The directive from Mr. Rohr, the one you've described, was that the first time he gave you instructions concerning Lenora Bellamy?" And Sully said no. He first mentioned her to me 8 months before the key incident. Said to keep track of the clerical staff in the Caldwell office. Said one of them was asking the wrong questions. 8 months. Rohr had known about her for 8 months before Sully found the key. 8 months before she ran. That meant the entire last year of her time in Caldwell, the year she'd been most careful, the year she'd been most afraid. Rohr had been watching her, and she hadn't known. She sat in the gallery and heard this and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but was located somewhere between them, in the specific register of understanding a danger you'd survived without knowing its full shape. Rhett, beside her, said nothing. His hand on the bench was close to hers the way it had been since the 3rd day, and she became aware of it the way you become aware of warmth, not suddenly, but as something that has been present long enough to feel necessary. She breathed. The damage Sully's redirect did to Pressman's case was not fatal by itself, but it was structural. Changed the picture from a vengeful woman pursuing a legitimate businessman to a legitimate businessman who had been monitoring a clerical employee for 8 months because she was getting too close to something he needed to keep hidden. Those were not the actions of an innocent man. Pressman knew it. She could see him know it in the slight adjustment of how he held himself for the remainder of the afternoon session. The 5th day was closing arguments. Carver's closing was methodical. He walked the jury through the documents, through the witness accounts, through Sully's testimony, and he built it into a single coherent structure, not eloquent, but sound. Kind of argument that doesn't move you but convinces you, which is ultimately more useful. Pressman's closing was the best thing she'd heard him do. Genuinely talented. And in his closing he deployed everything. He had the personal grievance argument, the reasonable doubt construction around the document's chain of custody, character portrait of Lenora as someone whose long isolation and personal loss had shaped her interpretation of events. It was persuasive in the way a skilled argument is persuasive even when you know it is wrong. She felt it working on her, slightly, the way skilled rhetoric works, even on people who can see its machinery. She watched the jury. The woman in the corner seat, the one who had looked at the evidence folders on the first day, was watching Pressman with the expression of someone who has already made a decision and is waiting for the other person to finish talking. The man in the second row, who had leaned forward at the word obsessive, was looking at his hands. The jury went out at 2 in the afternoon. The wait was 4 hours and 11 minutes. She knew the exact time because she counted it, which was what she did when she needed to occupy the part of her mind that would otherwise spend the time running catastrophic calculations. She sat in the hallway outside the courtroom on a wooden bench and counted and listened to Ridgemont going about its business outside the building's high windows. Rhett sat beside her. He had brought food from the boarding house, bread, cheese, something wrapped in cloth that turned out to be a piece of Mrs. Dupree's spiced cake, which she had apparently sent along for exactly this occasion, and which made Lenora's throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. She ate. It was something to do. Rhett ate the bread and said, after a long silence, "Whatever happens." She looked at him. "Whatever happens in there," he said. "The documents are in the federal record. The witnesses are in the federal record. Sully's testimony is in the federal record." He looked at the floor. "Even if the jury—" He stopped. "Even in the worst version, it doesn't disappear. It's there. Someone else can use it." She understood what he was doing. He was preparing her for a version of the outcome she had not let herself fully prepare for, because preparing for it had felt like inviting it. He was doing it carefully and without condescension, the way he did most difficult things. "I know," she said. "Do you?" She thought about it honestly. "I know it intellectually," she said. "I don't know if I know it in the way that would make it survivable." He was quiet for a moment. 4 years, he said. "You survived 4 years of carrying this alone. You'd survive a wrong verdict." "I would," she said. "I just don't know who I'd be on the other side of it." He looked at her with the directness that had become one of the things she relied on. "You'd be the person you are," he said. "That doesn't come from verdicts." She looked at him. There were things in his face that had been there for weeks, and that she had been allowing herself to see more clearly with each passing day, not because they were becoming more visible, but because she was becoming more willing to look at them. This was what 4 years of necessary self-protection did. It made you cautious about looking at things that required you to want something, because wanting things had been a liability. Wanting to stay in a place made you vulnerable to being pushed out of it. Wanting to trust someone made you vulnerable to being wrong about them. She had been wrong to want to stay in Caldwell. She had been wrong in the early weeks to think the arrangement at Black Pine was purely practical. She had been wrong about several things. She was not, she thought, wrong about this. "Rhett," she said, "yes." When this is over, she stopped. "Tried again. I don't know what I expected to feel when it was over. I spent 4 years thinking about getting to this point, and I didn't think very carefully about what came after it." He was watching her. "I don't want to go back to Missouri," she said. "There's nothing there that's mine anymore." She looked at the high window across the hallway. "And I don't want to." She stopped again. This was harder than testimony, harder than 2.5 hours of pressman. "I don't want to leave the mountain." The silence after this was the specific silence of something that has been in a room for a long time and has finally been named. Rhett said after a moment, "The mountain isn't going anywhere." "I know that," she said. "I'm asking about whether I am." He turned on the bench to face her more fully. This was unusual. He generally communicated in the direction of a shared horizon, rather than directly face to face, which was one of his habits she had mapped completely by now. "No," he said, "you're not." It was simply said. It was not a declaration, not a speech. It was the statement of a man for whom the decision had been made some time ago, and who had been waiting for the moment when saying it out loud was the right thing to do, rather than the premature thing. She looked at him. "The 30 days ended a long time ago," he said. "They did," she said. "You reorganized my entire supply chain," he said. "I'm not starting over with someone new." She laughed. Short, surprised. He almost smiled, the full version this time, or close to it, the version she'd seen only a few times. "That's your argument?" she said. "The supply chain?" "It's a good argument," he said. "It's a terrible argument. The other arguments," he said, "are ones I'd rather make on the mountain, not in a courthouse hallway." She understood. She accepted this. It was in its way, the right answer, the Rhett answer. Honest about the context, unwilling to perform something he meant to do properly. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They sat in the hallway for 2 more hours. The food was gone. The cake was very good. She made a mental note to tell Mrs. Dupree when they got back. At 6:14 in the evening, the bailiff appeared in the courtroom doorway and said the jury was back. The verdict took 4 minutes to read. Guilty on all counts: land fraud, document forgery, conspiracy to defraud, criminal intimidation, conspiracy to commit violence against witnesses in a federal investigation. All 5 counts. Unanimous. She heard the words and she heard the sound that moved through the courtroom gallery, not a roar, not a cheer. The particular sound of a large group of people exhaling simultaneously after holding a collective breath, and she sat very still and felt it all move through her. 4 years, 11 families, her father's gray face, the farmhouse door, all of it sitting inside this moment that was both the size she had expected and somehow different from what she'd imagined. Smaller in one way, it was just words, read by a court clerk in a flat official voice, in a room with dark wood paneling and high windows letting in the last of the evening light. Larger in another way that she couldn't yet measure, because she was still inside it. Augustus Rohr sat at the defense table and did not look at her. She noted this. He had looked at her once early in the trial, a deliberate look, the kind designed to communicate that he was not afraid. He did not look at her when the verdict was read. She thought about what that meant, whether it was dignity or defeat, or just the specific inwardness of a man processing the collapse of everything he'd built. She decided it didn't matter. His internal state was no longer her concern. Rhett was standing beside her when she stood. Shaw found them at the courtroom door. He shook Rhett's hand, and then he looked at Lenora with the expression of a man who has seen a lot of outcomes and knows this is a better one than most. The sentencing will be 6 weeks from now, he said. The land recovery process for the affected properties in Missouri will take longer. That's a separate proceeding. But the conviction gives it a foundation that didn't exist before. The Bellamy property, she said, is part of the recovery proceeding, he said carefully. I won't promise a specific outcome, but the grounds are there. She nodded. She had not let herself hope fully for that. Still didn't, not fully. But she let a small amount of it in, the way you let air into a sealed room. Carefully, to check if it's safe. Thank you, Marshal, she said. He nodded once. You did the work, he said. All of it. He moved on to speak to Carver. She stood in the doorway of the courtroom and looked back at the room, the empty jury box, the prosecution table, with its cleared files, the defense table where Pressman was talking quietly to a man she didn't recognize. At the front of the room, the clerk was organizing the court record, 247 pages. Now part of a federal conviction. Now part of the permanent record of what Augustus Rohr had done and what it had cost. She thought about what it costs to carry a thing alone for 4 years. Not the practical cost, the rooming houses, the temporary jobs, the constant state of being careful. The interior cost, the way it narrows you. The way you stop allowing yourself to want things that require staying. Because staying requires trust, and trust requires a kind of courage that coexists badly with constant fear. She thought about what it had taken to hand that over, to give the documents to Shaw, to stand in front of 60 people in a valley town and say, this is what is happening and here is the shape of it, to sit in a witness chair and hold for 2.5 hours, to say to Rhett in a courthouse hallway that she didn't want to leave the mountain. Each of those things had required her to stop protecting herself in ways she'd been protecting herself for years. Each of them had cost something, and each of them had given something back that the protection had been preventing her from having. This was not a simple trade. She didn't think of it as a simple trade. Protection had been necessary. The 4 years had been necessary. She didn't believe, in the way some people believed, that suffering was useful in and of itself, that difficulty builds character, or that pain teaches lessons that couldn't be learned any other way. She thought that was mostly something people told themselves to make sense of things that didn't need to be. What she believed was simpler and less comfortable. Some things cost what they cost, and you pay it, or you don't, and the outcome isn't guaranteed either way. She had paid 4 years. The outcome had gone the right direction. Those two facts were not causally simple, and she would not pretend they were. But she had stopped running. That was the part she kept returning to, standing in the doorway of the Ridgemont Federal Courtroom, with the last of the evening light coming in at an angle, and Rhett waiting behind her. She had spent 4 years in motion, moving between places, between positions, between the version of herself that was collecting evidence, and the version that was managing her fear of being found. She had been very good at the motion. It had kept her alive, and it had kept the documents intact, and it had brought her, finally, to this. And now she was still. Not because the danger was fully over, it wasn't. Not entirely, not in the way that left no residue. Rohr's network would take time to fully dismantle. The land recovery proceedings would be long and uncertain. There were people in the territorial administration who had taken Cascadia money and would not be happy about the conviction, and unhappy people with resources were worth watching. But she was still, in herself. In the specific way you become still, when the thing you have been running toward and running from simultaneously has finally resolved into something you can stand in front of and name. She turned from the doorway. They rode back to Black Pine Mountain 2 days later, after the formal post-trial documentation was complete, and Shaw had what he needed from both of them for the sentencing proceeding. The mountain appeared as it always appeared, when they came up the switchbacks in stages, revealing itself slowly, the way things reveal themselves when they have nothing to prove. Pines were the same pines. The air had the same quality she'd registered on her first day, sharper and drier than Missouri air. The kind of air that made you notice you were breathing. Wade was in the yard when they pulled in. He looked at their faces and he read them the way he read most things, quickly, accurately, without making a performance of the reading. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Well, guilty on all 5, Rhett said. Wade looked at Lenora. "All 5. All 5, she said. He nodded. That was all. But his eyes said something larger than the nod, and she received it. Mrs. Dupree, who had clearly been watching from the kitchen window, appeared on the porch. She looked at them, took a breath, and said, "I'll put the big pot on." Supper that night was the largest meal Lenora had eaten in months, possibly years, Mrs. Dupree's version of a celebration was to cook as if she was personally angry at any possibility of remaining hunger. The hands came in from the bunkhouse. Cass Merritt sat across from Lenora and said nothing about the verdict, but nodded at her once. The same kind of nod Wade had given. The nod that meant more than it looked like. After supper, when the hands had drifted back out and Mrs. Dupree had efficiently cleared the table and disappeared into the kitchen, Lenora and Rhett sat at the table with their coffee. It was quiet in the particular way the ranch was quiet, not empty, but settled. The working quiet of a place that knew what it was. "I want to propose something," Lenora said. Rhett waited. "The land recovery proceedings in Missouri, they'll take months, possibly longer. Shaw will need documentation support, ongoing. And there are other families in other territories who have had this Cascadia approach that haven't reached the point of a formal complaint yet." She looked at her coffee cup. "Someone needs to help those families understand what they have and what to do with it. Someone needs to be the bridge between what happened in the evidence and what a family standing in front of a land officer actually needs to know." He was watching her. "I'd like to do that work from here," she said. "From the ranch. It would require some travel to Ridgemont for the Missouri proceedings, to whatever valleys need it." She looked up. The mountain would be the base. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a different kind of work than managing a ranch's supply accounts." "It's not entirely different," she said. "It's the same skill. Pattern recognition, documentation, knowing which piece of paper matters and why." Steadily. "I know what skill it is," he said. "I'm not questioning the skill." He turned his cup in his hands. "I'm asking whether you understand what you're saying. Staying here, making this the base." He met her eyes. "That's a particular kind of commitment." "I know what kind of commitment it is," she said. He held her look. "I've been careful about wanting things for 4 years," she said. "I'm trying something different." This landed somewhere in him that she could see, in the way things landed with him that mattered, the slight shift in his breathing, the quality of the silence that followed. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They drank their coffee. Outside, the mountain was dark, the way it was always dark, not ominously, just absolutely. The dark of a place that had been here long before anyone built anything on it, and would be here long after. Indifferent and enduring, and large enough to contain whatever the people on it were working through. They married in the spring. It was not a large wedding. Wade stood beside Rhett. Mrs. Dupree stood beside Lenora and cried from the moment the ceremony began, which she would have been embarrassed about if anyone had mentioned it, which no one did. Cass Merritt and 6 of the other hands stood in the yard in their better clothes. The judge who performed the ceremony was from Black Pine Crossing, the same town, the same valley where Lenora had stood on a flatbed wagon 4 months earlier and told 60 people the shape of what was coming. Some of those 60 people were there. Dorothea Crane, who had produced the letter from her coat pocket in a federal courtroom and handed it to the clerk with the composure of someone who had been ready for this moment for months. 2 of the other witnesses. The valley was small, and word traveled the way it always traveled, and the people who had stood up during the difficult part did not need a formal invitation to the good part. It was not a perfect day. The weather was uncertain. A cold front had pushed through overnight, and the morning was grayer than they'd wanted. And Mrs. Dupree's cake had a slight problem on one side that she addressed by rotating it away from the guests, which Lenora pretended not to notice. Rhett's best shirt had a button that came loose during the ceremony, and he spent a portion of his own wedding vows aware of the button, which was the kind of small human reality that nobody puts in stories, but that is always present in actual lives. He meant the vows. She could tell, in the way she could tell most things about him by now, by the specific quality of his attention, the way he was present without performing presence. She meant hers. Not because they had gone the way she'd planned, nothing about this had gone the way she'd planned. She had planned an exit. A safe location, a temporary arrangement, enough distance from Roar to buy herself time. She had planned to be strategic and self-contained, and to leave when the situation resolved, carrying whatever she'd gained in skills or stability or distance, and moving on to the next version of herself. She had not planned Rhett. She had not planned Wade or Mrs. Dupree or Cass Merritt or the mountain in the particular quality of morning light when the air was cold and clear. She had not planned feeling, for the first time in 4 years, that the place she was standing was a place she'd chosen rather than a place she'd landed. This was the thing about running, she had come to understand. Keeps you alive. It is sometimes the only thing that keeps you alive, and it should not be apologized for, and it should not be romanticized out of existence by people who have never needed it. But it has a cost that compounds over time, and the cost is this: you get very good at leaving and very bad at arriving. You get so good at assessing exits that you stop fully entering the rooms. She had entered this room, this mountain, this ranch, this life that had not been on any list she'd made in 4 years of careful, frightened planning. She had entered it fully, or as fully as she knew how, which was not perfectly, because she was not a person who did things perfectly, and because the room itself was not perfect, and because perfect was not the point. The point was that she was here. The Bellamy Callaway Land Fund was established 8 months after the trial, using a portion of Rhett's operating capital and Lenora's expertise in land documentation and legal process navigation. It was not a large organization. It never became a large organization, because large organizations require management structures that take energy away from the work itself, and she had learned in 4 years to be suspicious of anything that grew faster than it could be understood. It was a small, specific operation. She identified families facing fraudulent land claims, helped them understand their documentation, connected them with federal contacts who could act on what they had, and stayed with the cases long enough to see them through to resolution, or to understand clearly why resolution wasn't possible. Some cases resolved, some didn't. This was the part she had to learn to carry differently than she'd carried the 4 years, not with the forward momentum of someone running toward a destination, but with the steadier weight of someone who had accepted that the work was longer than any single person's effort and would continue after her, and that doing her portion of it well was enough. It was not always easy to believe that. Rhett, on the evenings when she came back from a case that hadn't gone the way she'd needed it to go, would bring her coffee and sit with her in the working quiet of the ranch. And he would not tell her that it was enough, or that she'd done what she could, or any of the other things people said in those moments that were true and useless at the same time. He would just be there, in the way he'd been there throughout present, without requiring anything, carrying his portion of the weight without performing the carrying. She thought sometimes about what she would have said to herself 4 years earlier, standing in the hallway of a Caldwell rooming house with a document box wrapped in oilcloth, and a plan that was really just the next step after the last step, no further. She thought she would have said, "It is going to cost more than you think, and it is going to give back more than you think. And the place you land is not going to look like anything you planned." And she thought the version of herself in that hallway would have said, "Is it worth it?" She didn't have a clean answer for that. She had never been a person who dealt in clean answers, and she wasn't going to become one now. What she had was this: a mountain, and a man who brought coffee and asked real questions and meant what he said, and work that mattered, and the specific sensation new enough that she still noticed it, present enough that she no longer doubted it, of being somewhere she had chosen to be. Outside, Black Pine Mountain held its ground the way it always had. The work continued. So did she.